when we think about stress, like how, when we're doing too much, the hormone that comes to mind there is cortisol, or, working in the sympathetic nervous
Yeah.
system. So the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or HPA for short. So one of the telltale signs that a woman is pushing herself too hard, like where she's gaining weight, it tends to be through the belly. And once we can kind of start to attune with our own rhythms, one of those being our menstrual cycle, but also just listening to your body. Is your body telling you that you're tired? I think I'm going to take a day off today, even though I was supposed to do leg day, or even though I was supposed to do soul cycle, even though I'm just tired today, I'm going to give myself what I need. I think that's when we can really begin to heal from all aspects, all different dimensions of health.
On so many levels, a lot of the content as of late has been about women of a special age. I always say, perimenopause and beyond, but we really have had a lot of interest in bringing on, female health specialists that can talk about, our more fertile years when we're a little bit younger, what's going on with our bodies. I get a lot of questions about, for example, about the menstrual cycle. And I know this is an area where you really shine. So let's dive right in and let's talk about what's going on with our bodies each month when we're having a cycle.
Sure. So this is, and I'll actually just pre-frame this by saying that I went to a high level female entrepreneurial group, and I think the topic was like having, being successful, with eating and training. And I just put in like a little graph of the menstrual cycle, and we literally had a 2 hour Q&A after the talk. So what that really showed me was that even women, like 7 and 8 figure women, doing really, really well in their business, haven't really revisited what it is, like the ebbs and flows of their hormonal milieu over the course of the
Mhm.
month. And we all, maybe got it for like, a couple of uncomfortable days in high school. We
Yeah.
learned about the menstrual cycle
Yeah.
and then we moved on. But I think that as an adult female, irrespective of your age, I think it's really important for us to be able to harness the power that comes from understanding where we are in the cycle and how we can adapt for self-care, for nutrition, for exercise, for all the things. So I'll give you like a little crash course in menstruation, right? Like 101. There's typically 4 weeks. The average cycle is around 28, 29, 30 days, although we do have a bit of a spread there. So 26 to 32, 33 days is still considered normal. For the ease of just explaining it, I usually just break it up into 4 weeks. So if yours is 4.5 weeks or it's 3.5 weeks, you're just going to modify, your phases. Like each week is going to be either shorter or longer, just depending on your cycle length. So week one is your bleed week. So this is when you are shedding the endometrial lining. In terms of the hormonal landscape, pretty much everyone, all the hormones that are involved in menstruation, they've all taken a vacation, except for FSH, follicular stimulating hormone. She's like holding down the fort, trying to develop the next follicle for the next cycle. Estrogen's low, progesterone's on vacation somewhere on a beach, testosterone's low. So we have all of these things relatively low. Um, this is in term, and I'll kind of pull in a little bit of nutrition and training as we kind of go through it. But that first week, the first couple days, a lot of women tend to feel a little sluggish, maybe a little achy, a little crampy. This is the time where you are allowed to be slow. And I start off with this because there's so many women, myself included, who spent years trying to fight against my own biology. I was like, doesn't matter. I got my period. I gotta build muscle. I gotta do the diet. I gotta do the thing, whatever it is. And you push yourself, beyond sometimes your physical and your, the limits of your, like the finite capacity of your matter. So um, give yourself a couple days, nice walks, maybe some yoga, maybe some Pilates, and then once you sort of feel, you get into the rhythm of your bleed week or the rhythm of your period, then you can kind of get back to your, regular exercise regimen, whatever that may be. This is a really great time I know you're a really big fan of fasting, and I mirror that. This is a really great time for more I'll call them more aggressive fast. Like in the first two, I'll say, and I'll actually pull this back out a little bit. The first 2 weeks of our cycle, so the follicular phase, this is the time of the follicle. This is a great time for more, I use the word aggressive, but it's just more restrictive fasting. So maybe more water fasting, And then in the luteal phase, which we'll get to, then I tend to change the type of fasts and the type of nutrition that we have. So, week one, bleed week, great for a fast, great for a ketogenic diet as well. If you've never tried keto, again, your body is much more resilient to macronutrient restriction in this first week. Second week, so you've stopped your bleed. This is now two main things are happening. We are leading up to ovulation, which is actually the main point. Like I mean, whenever we're tracking our cycle, it's like day one is the bleed, right? Like that's when we start. But actually, the most important part of your cycle is that you ovulate. So we are in the second week, we are leading up to this ovulation, this like the main event, right? So what happens hormonally is we're going to have two main things happen. One is we're going to see estrogen have like it's the biggest and quickest rise of estrogen in our cycle. So we will go from something like, there's a big range from woman to woman, but somewhere around 5 picograms per milliliter, all the way up to like 300, so there's a big rising, very steep change in estrogen concentration. And this is because we are trying to mature the follicle. Estrogen is a trophic hormone. It is a growth hormone. So it's trying to develop and drive growth in the follicle. The other thing that we get in week two is a rise in testosterone. And so this is really important. This is actually why we feel really sexy. We feel really flirty. Maybe we're like, chasing our husband or partner around the dining room table as I do in week two, right? Because we have this testosterone. And testosterone is really important for many things, lean body muscle, like lean muscle mass. It's important for body composition. So this week, in terms of fasting, just to kind of to continue the story of fasting, I tend to move away from more aggressive, like water fasts here. And maybe because I'm really concerned around either maintaining my own muscle mass or my clients or drive or building more, the type of fast I tend to like to recommend here for both myself and the women that I work with is more of a time restricted eating type of fast. And, I'm sure that this has been covered on your podcast before, but time restricted eating is basically you're still eating every day. You're just concerned about the eating window in which you are doing it. So for me, a very easy, everyday fast or a TRE is going to be a 16-8, where I have 8 hours where I eat and 16 hours where I don't. And in terms of macronutrient composition, so we talked about keto being really great in that first week, very resilient, really good to restrict your carbohydrates in week one, maybe even restrict your proteins. In week two, I actually like to there's a bit of a protein cycling. So I actually like to jack up proteins in week two. And part of that is to profit from that increase in testosterone. This is the only time in our menstrual cycle where we see testosterone rise as high as it does. So when we think about what grows muscle, we can do it two ways. One is through the diet, eating protein, and the other way is mechanical stimulation. Hopefully, you're doing some sort of resistance training. So, I like to increase your protein concentration this week so that your testosterone actually has a lot of work. Like we make testosterone busy. So, she has a lot of stuff to do. She's building up your muscles this week. Main event happens, ovulation at the end of week two. So this is, we see a rise in something called luteinizing hormone. Luteinizing hormone helps release the egg. It's like the beautiful, the Chanel bag, like releases the little pearl, or the oyster releases the little pearl, right? And then we move into the luteal phase. And this is where we see this kind of dramatic change in our hormonal landscape. So in weeks one and two, you might make the argument that we are more extroverted, we are more chatty. We have estrogen driving up our facial, plumping up our lips and our cheeks and our, and our vertebral, our articulation centers in the brain. In week three, post ovulation, this is where I like to, what we see in terms of hormones, we see estrogen kind of, right before ovulation takes a nosedive, and then she starts to slowly rise up again, because what we're doing is the follicle that released the egg is now turned into something called the corpus luteum, and which that's actually what the phase is named after. This is the luteal phase after the corpus luteum. So corpus luteum now is going to be secreting progesterone. Your body, whether or not you want to have a baby, is going to try to build up the endometrial lining in anticipation of a fertilized egg. So, word of caution, if you are trying to get pregnant, this is the time, like right before ovulation and immediately right after. This is the time where you want to be having lots and lots of sex. If you don't want a baby, this is the time where you can play with some other things, right? You can have some other fun things that you and your partner can play around with. So in terms of hormones, we start to see like a secondary rise in estrogen again. It's not as high as the first apex that we see in week 2, but it's going to be more of a constant. And then towards the end of that third week, now we're starting to see progesterone. This is the main hormone of the luteal phase. She's going to be starting to rise up at the end of sort of mid week 3, and then she reaches her peak kind of at the end of week 3, beginning of week 4, like day 21, 22 ish. So again, in terms of nutrition, I actually like to return to a ketogenic diet. I like to, depending on the woman's hormonal status and kind of depending on our conversation, where we can go, we can like kind of piece apart things. But I will either recommend again water fasting, typically if she's androgen dominant, like we get back, or like PCOS type of clinical presentation, and maybe a water fast is appropriate. That we can also do caloric liquid fasting, so lots of bone broth, where you're fasting. It's not technically a fast, like you're still consuming calories, but we're having it in liquid form.
Mhm.
And then week 4, just to sort of tie it all up in a bow, this is like do or die. Like you are either pregnant or you're not, and all of your resources are going to go towards building up your endometrial lining. So this is where we will see, if we were actually to take, some blood work, we would look at the serum or we look at the plasma. We're going to see an increased utilization in glucose, which is the breakdown of carbohydrate. We're going to see increased utilization of amino acids, free fatty acids, all of these things. So I actually like in week 4, and some people kind of freak out when I say this, but I actually like you to increase your calories in week 4. And it's because your body needs it. It's not because you're breaking the diet. It's not because you have no willpower and there's something wrong with you. It's like physiologically, your body is building up a new organ. It is building up the endometrial lining. You need more calories to support that. So I will tend to, again, I up everything. So all fats, protein in terms of caloric intake goes up. 10 to 15% is usually the recommendation that I give. So it's not the whole Haagen-Dazs store. It's just,
A
it's
little
just
bit.
just a little bit, it's extra protein bar or something like that. And then I will also change the ratios again. So it's not ketogenic anymore. It is going to be more like a 40-40-20. So like 40 fats, 40 proteins, and then the fill is going to be carbohydrates. And then hopefully at the end of week 4, so progesterone drops if there's no fertilized egg. And then like the corpus luteum starts to degenerate, no more progesterone. The endometrial lining becomes ischemic, and then you start to shed it. And then that's week 1 again. That's the bleed week. So that's kind of your period and your menstrual cycle in a bit of a nutshell, with some nutrition there thrown in.
No, one of the reasons why I wanted to bring you on was I think you've got a really wonderfully unique kind of take, kind of incorporating all of those things together. I don't see a lot of people taking the nutrition piece and taking in the workout piece and really like digging into the physiology of what's going on with our bodies. Now, I had a couple questions about the menstrual cycle in particular. So you touched on some of this already. So for individuals that might be, you mentioned androgen dominant. So someone
Yeah,
that's polycystic ovarian syndrome, we had a great podcast with Nadia talking about this specifically. And not everyone with PCOS is necessarily significantly obese. You can still be thin and have
correct.
PCOS. And
Correct.
so for the individuals that are struggling a bit more and they have weight issues, how would you guide them differently through their menstrual cycle? I know you mentioned, talking about some of the bone broth and things like that, but recognizing that they're already a little bit insulin resistant or
Yeah.
maybe quite a bit.
Yeah.
How do you navigate making recommendations to them throughout their cycle?
Yeah, this is a great question, and thank you for asking that. So you're correct in obesity and PCOS are not always sisters, right? Like they don't always happen in tandem with each other. So it's more often than not that we see obesity happening alongside, but you can have a normal BMI and still have a problem aromatizing or still have a problem with conversion of your testosterone to your estrogens. And as you correctly said, a lot of the physiology here does have to do with insulin resistance. So I know Dr. Jason Fung has talked about insulin resistance as it relates to PCOS. I think he's written a couple of articles on them as well. And I'm sure there's, as you said, many other experts that you've had on the show. So my approach here is going to be in terms of nutrition, the ketogenic diet. We talk about this. I mean, it's funny because we often hear it's like, oh, it's a fad. And oh, it's like, well, I mean, if you're eating bacon, butter, and burgers on repeat, yeah, like that's not sustainable over the long term. We need to be developing a green or like having lots of plants. So a ketogenic diet for a woman with PCOS, I would be kind of plugging the first my approach to care for her would be to go all keto for at least a month. So to have a plant-based ketogenic diet. And what that means is that you are consuming lots of green leafy vegetables. So the kales, the Swiss chard, the bok choy, the arugula, the spinach, all. So that's going to make the base of your plate. Your protein is going to be about 20% of your total calories. I usually will give people a visual, like just like kind of the size of your palm is about, an appropriate portion size for you. And then the fat is the fill. And we get keto wrong, I think, a lot because we think, oh my God, it's like so she's talking about like 70% fat. And it's like, yes, but the caloric density of fat is more than double that of protein and carbohydrates. So you have 9 kilocalories per gram for a fat versus 4 for protein and carbohydrates. So you actually need a little bit of fat to go a long way, right? You actually need half of the amount of fat in terms of quantity in order to kind of meet the caloric expectations there. So for a woman with PCOS, it would be like a 70-20-10. That's what I really like. So we get 70% of her calories are coming from fat, 20 from protein, 10, from carbohydrates, but all the carbohydrates, almost actually all of the carbohydrates are those green leafy vegetables. So she's getting a lot of the fiber, she's getting the sulforaphanes, which are going to help drive not only phase two conjugation, which is a step in detoxification in the liver, but it's also going to help with her aromatize it. It's going to help with the conversion of testosterones to estrogens. So lots and lots of green leafy vegetables, and it's actually super easy to eat that way. It's like you saute a little bit of Swiss chard, maybe a little bit of garlic and olive oil, your piece of chicken or whatever, and then you have the olive oil is your fat source. So I'd have her doing that for at least a month to sort of get the insulin under control, because we know the pairing to insulin to the macronutrient is the carbohydrate. So we want to be able to restrict carbohydrates as much as we can to bring down her insulin level so we can begin to resensitize her cells to that. In terms of fasting, I mentioned it briefly when we were sort of talking about the menstrual cycle in its totality, but I would say that water fasting is going to be something that is a more aggressive type of fast. But again, fasting is like you're restricting everything, right? You're restricting all macronutrients, including the carbohydrates and including the protein. So this is also a really great way to help with her insulin sensitivity. You can't just jump into a 3-day water fast. So if you're listening to this and you're like, wow, that's really great, I'm just not going to eat from now until 3 days from now, I would say, please be slow. The number one rule of fasting is listening to your body. You can't just jump into and I'll say this from experience because I used to I listened to the Jason Fungs and the Peter Attias and the Dom D'Agostino's, and I was like, oh my gosh, these are my heroes. Like, I'm totally going to do exactly what they're doing. And of course, completely messed up my own menstrual cycle because I forgot that I was a woman, like
Oh,
I
we're
don't,
not many men.
yeah, we are not mini men. We're not small men, even though I know that many women, including myself, like to pretend that we are. So
Yeah.
you have to very slowly kind of, aggregate your fat or, improve your fasting tolerance over time. And I can, I've written articles on that. I'd be happy to share that with your readers or your listeners if they're interested in learning more. But water fasting is kind of one of my favorite things to do. And then of course the other piece of it in terms of insulin sensitivity, and we haven't talked about this quite as much detail yet, is really the idea of resistance training. So when we think about the muscle mass that we have, the more muscle mass that you have, the better glucose disposal agent you are. And what I mean by that is when you do eat carbohydrates, your muscles, the more muscle you have, that is functional active tissue. So the more functional active tissue, they want to gobble up the carbohydrates. That will be you'll be able to dump the glucose basically in the liver and in the muscles more efficiently. And the really nice thing about the muscles is that once the glucose gets in there, they can't get out. Like they're missing that phosphate group, right? So once we get the glucose in, or the glycogen, which would be glucose dumping into the muscle, like it stays there. So I always say it's like Vegas, like what stays in, like what goes in Vegas, it stays there, right? So for a woman with PCOS, like it's kind of a three-pronged approach in terms of like nutrition would be a ketogenic diet, at least for 28, at least 1 month, but sometimes we'll cycle it. Sometimes fat adaptation will take a little longer. So anywhere from like 6 to 12 weeks is sort of what I've seen. So 1, 2, or 3 cycles of just pure keto, and then I would start in integrating the fasting that we talked about, the water fasting, at least the daily fasting to start, and then there'd be a resistance training component to it as well, with the long-term goal of increasing her lean muscle mass so that she can better regulate her insulin.
So this is a really important distinction that you're making. I think many women have been conditioned to believe that we want to do chronic cardio,
Oh yes,
irrespective of what age we are.
yeah,
And what I have come to find is that the way to, and this is a natural function of aging, as women and men get closer to 40, so middle age, we there's something called sarcopenia, and so that's
correct.
this muscle loss with age. We don't want that to happen because there are lots of unfortunate things that come from that. Like I think about my little cardiology patients years and years ago that, I was looking at them. I'm like, gosh, they have so much muscle wasting. They're skinny, but they're just, I mean, their muscles are just so thin and kind of sinewy, not in a good way.
It's the marbling that you see, like with a
Yeah.
nice steak, right? It's
Yeah.
like the
Yes,
fatty
exactly.
infiltration in the
Yes.
muscle. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And so you definitely don't want this. So if you're listening to this episode in particular, we've heard before from other female physicians, we want to make sure we are doing weight training. We want to ensure we are building muscle throughout our lifetime. And it becomes even more critical as we are getting older. But I think it's such an important, I always say I never miss leg day. Like I do 2 leg workouts a
Yes,
week
that's my
because leg
girl.
day, yeah, exactly. I
Mm,
was like, so leg day is the most important day you can get into the gym. And I
mm.
recognize there may be people listening that are under COVID restrictions and social distancing restrictions, and maybe you can't get to your gym, but you can do body weight exercises. There's so many things you can
Or you
do.
hold your laundry detergent and do 100
Yeah,
squats.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. You want those big muscle groups. So I love that you kind of touched on that. And one thing that I want to kind of pivot on is there are probably women listening that are taking hormonal birth control.
Mm.
And yeah, I want to be very upfront. I mean, I was that thin PCOS person, which I didn't know. I had a very irregular cycle in my late teens, early 20s, and my doc, of course, put me on the pill, and I had the worst PMS in the world, which of course I was so worried. I didn't want to not have a regular cycle. In my mind, I was still having a cycle, which I wasn't.
Mm.
And then I got married and we went off the pill. And it was this deep dive of realization, like, not only do I not have bad PMS, it was from the synthetic hormones. But I think about, women feeling kind of trapped in the sense that they want reliable birth control, but feeling like, they just don't understand that they're really not having a period. It's breakthrough bleeding. So let's kind of touch on like people that are on oral contraceptives, and there's no judgment because like I said, I was on the pill for forever.
100%.
Oral contraceptives or an IUD. Let's talk about how that influences the communication so that the entire endocrine system, our entire hormonal system is governed by our brain. So we've got this hypothalamus pituitary axis and all these hormones, all this beautiful orchestration. And I never had enough appreciation for the endocrine system until I hit middle age.
Hmm.
But let's talk about why that's so important and what happens when we take these synthetic hormones, just so that people understand the distinction. Like you've beautifully, eloquently stated what goes on with the menstrual cycle under normal circumstances. But when we're taking synthetic hormones, talk about this disconnect between our brain and our bodies.
Sure. So when we're on oral contraception, I think that And we've done quite a few on my own podcast. We've done quite a few like shows on this. We've had guests on, and we've also done a lot of AMAs. And I think that what happens is when and this is why I love what you're doing with the podcast, because you are empowering women to make better decisions. Because what happens is a woman will have acne, or she'll have irregular periods, as you're saying, or something. She goes into her allopathic physician's office, her medical doctor, and the doctor says, okay, I'm just going to, here's a birth control pill to fix that. So before we even kind of get into the pill, I just want to pull back a little bit in terms of the philosophy that's happening there. So when you go to the medical doctor, they want to fix the symptom. They want to fix the symptom of the acne. They want to fix the symptom of the irregular cycle. So they are going to give you they're going to give you a medication that is going to kind of fix that. And we were just talking about this in the pre-chat, right? Like we are conditioned, right? We
Yeah.
go into the doctor, we're like, I have this problem. I want to walk out with a bottle that's going to fix this in 3 to 5 days, right? So we also levy that expectation onto our physicians. So I'm not poo-pooing on medical doctors. I have many colleagues who are, but you have to understand that they are trained in this allopathic model where it's like, there's a problem, and there's a drug that is going to cover up the problem to air quotes, if you're listening to this not seeing it, fix it, right? So when we take an oral contraceptive, what that is effectively doing, it is making your body think that you are pregnant. You are taking progestin. You are not taking progesterone. So progesterone, which we talked about before, in the luteal phase, this is the natural hormone. You are getting a synthetic, and you are also getting estrogen, and that is making your body think that you are pregnant. So what happens is your brain no longer, there's negative feedback. You were saying like, I never appreciated the endocrine system. It is so beautifully complex. Like it would be complete hubris and arrogance for anyone to say, yeah, like I totally get it. Like what I totally get the hormones
Yeah.
and the endocrine system. There are checks and balances that are in the endocrine system to make sure that we don't overload, or we don't go or like too far in any direction on any different continuum. So when you're taking the oral when you're taking the birth control pill or any sort of hormonal contraception, you are essentially shutting down the connection between your brain and your reproductive organs, which is your ovaries. So there are, like you said, you're not actually bleeding. It is a medical bleed. So you don't actually have the feedback. You don't actually have the feedback in terms of where you are in your cycle, what is happening. And the other issue is which is kind of the more important one, is you're not actually fixing, you're not actually fixing usually the problem why you originally sought out care. So if it's acne or if it's irregular periods, just sort of artificially making sure that you have this artificial bleed every 28 days is not actually fixing the problem. So we want to have the courage as women to give ourselves a little bit more grace and a little bit more time to figure out what's going on. I know the pill's easy. I know it's like, yep, I'm like in a month, like everything's going to be like, a-okay. But giving ourselves as women, especially the type A women who are listening, because you are my people. I am you. I get it. Like we want the fix, right? We want it right now. But giving yourself a little bit more of a runway, giving yourself a bit more grace and ease and less pressure to say, okay, I have the acne. I have this irregular, what could be going on? Is there something in my diet? Is there something in my sleep? Is there something contaminant in my environment? Is there things that I can try to work on naturally first and give myself the time to actually step into that before taking the pill. Now, if you are on the pill and maybe it's for contraception, I mean, that's fine. Again, like I said, no judgment, love you anyway. But as long as you understand the risks, right? Like as long as you fully understand and have informed consent in terms of what the risks are, because there's a lot of fertility challenges that we see with women who are on long-term birth control pill. Most studies on the birth control pill have not been done long-term. They've only been done for a couple months. Like, yep, it's okay. But we keep women on the pill for like 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. And then they get off the pill. They're like, okay, I want a baby. Right. But then their brain, their reproductive system has essentially not been active for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, however long it is. So you have to give yourself a little bit of time there in order to reestablish that connection. Um, I don't know if I'm answering your question. I know I've gone off on a couple of tangents there, but
No, I
yeah,
think it's really helpful because I don't see enough women talking about this. And I think
yeah.
because I'm done having babies. I've got two teenagers and, it's hard for me to wrap my head around the fact eventually they will leave the nest and
Hmm.
my life will go on with my husband. But I think it's really important that women understand you have options beyond
Yes.
just I had a symptom. I mean, my best friend from high school, the best example is she's been on the pill, honest to God, for forever. And we were having a conversation and she said, I don't even know if I stopped taking the pill if I would get a period. And I said, well, how long have you been on the pill? And we had this conversation. It's been such a long time. She
Mm.
just assumed that when she got her period, it was a period. And I said, no, that's breakthrough bleeding. And I think there are still a lot of healthcare providers and being a nurse practitioner, there's no judgment. I recognize the way that my training was working, it was designed to address symptom management. And, it wasn't so much focused on root cause management, which I later learned. But the point of why I'm sharing this is I want people to understand that prescription is not always the answer to every single problem we're experiencing. It could be a lifestyle choice. It could be that you need to, as you mentioned very eloquently, you may need to change your diet. And I think there's not enough of us talking about that. The nutrition piece, I always say it always starts with food. But let's pivot a little bit and talk about, one of the other big problems that I see happening with people. A lot of women want to make intermittent fasting work for them for
Hmm.
a variety of different reasons.
Hmm.
Generally, women that gravitate towards me, it's because they want to lose weight.
Yes.
And I remind people, intermittent fasting is a great strategy for most people, not everyone. And sometimes it's a temporary thing. It may be that you're in a position where you're really not able to participate, or you start doing intermittent fasting, you're not getting results, and you just try to make it harder on yourself. So it's, trying to put a square peg into a round hole. Sometimes it just doesn't work. And so I think of the menstrual cycle as a barometer for our bodies of letting us know if we're overtaxing our bodies, doing too much. And
Hmm.
so I would imagine you probably see women that are pushing their bodies way too hard, whether it's emotionally, physically, philosophically, psychologically, they're just pushing too.
Neurospiritually, yes, in
Exactly.
all the ways we do
Yes.
that. Yes, yes.
Yes. And I think
Yeah.
COVID is really, and in so many ways, has really made it harder for everyone to manage their stress. So curious to know some of the things that you're looking for when you're working with women that are letting you know that they're overdoing it, that intermittent fasting is a hormetic stressor and certainly a beneficial one, but perhaps they're doing things a little bit too way harder than their body can absorb.
Yeah, and I love this question, and you actually alluded a little bit to one of my sort of yellow flags before, which is like the high intensity interval training 4, 5, 6 times a week. It's like usually when a woman, so I have a lot of women that'll come to me as well, and they'll say, I want to lose weight, and so when we think about stress, like how when we're doing too much, the hormone that comes to mind there is cortisol, or working in the sympathetic nervous
Yeah.
system, so the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or HPA for short. So one of those hormones is cortisol. So one of the telltale signs that a woman is pushing herself too hard is that she had, like, where she's gaining weight, it tends to be through the belly. She tends to be inflamed. So, in that luteal, in that second phase of her, or the second 2 weeks rather, of her menstrual cycle, it's hard for her rings. It's hard for her to get her rings on. She feels puffy. She feels swollen. Maybe she feels moody. She has sleep disturbances. Her breasts are angry, like they're tender. So these are some things that tell me that her hormones are out of whack. But in particular, when we think about stress and stress dominance, or sympathetic dominance, if we want to talk about it in the context of the nervous system, we might find that her behaviors, things like wanting to snack frequently, or in the evening, she may want to go to sleep, but her brain, or like her mind, is racing. So like the little acronym, or the little jingle is like wired and tired, right? So she's
Yep.
tired, but she's so wired that she can't actually wind down. She may find that she may get fatigued after exercises, that like going up a flight of stairs, or after intercourse. Like so all of these little clues when you're taking, the other big one, actually, I can't believe I forgot this one, is needing coffee. So
Yeah.
she needs coffee to wake up. She's bagged at 10 in the morning, and at 2 o'clock, like right at like that sort of 2 to 4 slump, I'll call it. She has this energetic slump between 2 p.m. and 4 p.m. So she needs to have some sort of pick me up. That tells me that she is driving, her cortisol levels are probably higher than what they should be. So, in terms of a woman pushing herself too hard, those are sort of clinical pearls or things that I would look for to tell me that a woman is overdoing it. She's also going to be a type A personality. So, she's going to like answer the question before the doctor, asks
Yeah.
it. She's probably going to she's going to be doing like her high intensity interval training 3, 4, 5 times a week because she needs that hit of dopamine.
Mhm.
And we've taught, like Dr. Sarah Gottfried beautifully talks about this in the context of like dopamine addiction. So like we
Yep.
have this dopamine insufficiency syndrome where we are jacking the dopamine. Like we do the soul cycle, we do the whatever the thing. And
Mhm.
I always use soul cycle. I mean, I love this company. I'm
Yeah.
not trying to poo poo on it, but when you do it 7 times a week,
Yeah.
or you're on your Peloton and you're doing that like 7 times a week, like maybe we want to dial it back and we want to
Mhm.
put in some resistance training. We want to go for some walks with our family. We want to mix things up so that we are doing both a combination of high and low, higher intensity interval training, maybe once or twice a week is kind of like the max.
Yep.
And for a woman who's like type A personality, it's like I cut it off at one because I know she's
Mhm.
going to do two if I tell her one.
Mhm.
Um, so these are some of the clues and some of the sort of
Mhm.
the clinical picture of a woman who's like driving herself into the ground. And I think that we want to also peel back another layer here. So why is she doing that?
Mhm.
So what is the emotional driver? And I often talk about this in terms of like how we've been cultured as women, right? So as women, we have been told to smile, everything's always okay, even though our life might be unfurling like a ball of yarn, everything's always fine. And we've also been taught that our worth is intimately connected, pardon me, to our productivity. The more productive we are, the more worthy we are. So we continue to look for these external sources. Well, if I do 5 classes instead of 4, well, if I run around and sign my children up for, 6 soccer classes a week instead of, what everyone else is doing, which is 3, somehow I'm going to be a better mother or I'm going to be more worthy the more things I put on my plate. And one of my missions really in terms of, we were talking in the pre-chat about the book that's coming up that I'm writing and all this kind of stuff is really to help women unhitch. We want to unhitch this idea that our productivity and our worth are related to each other because they are not. And once we can kind of start to attune with our own rhythms, one of those being our menstrual cycle, but also just listening to your body. Is your body telling you that you're tired? What language does your body speak? Listening to your body, the language of your body and honoring her because your body is a temple. It is a goddess worthy of worshiping. So the closer that you can get to saying, wow, like I'm really tired. Like, I think I'm going to take a day off today, even though I was supposed to do leg day, or even though I was supposed to do soul cycle, or even though I'm just tired today, I'm going to give myself what I need. I think that's when we can really begin to heal from all aspects, all different dimensions of health. So, like metabolic, body composition, neuro, spiritual, emotional.
Well, our very first question is from Nellie. And Nellie said, I have a diastasis recti, but
Mm.
want to start weight training for the first time. Any advice? So, for listeners to understand, this is a separation of your abdominal muscles. Common to see this after pregnancy. I had this. Sometimes you can work around it with targeted physical therapy. But what are your thoughts when a woman comes to you and they already have had this diagnosed? How do they navigate weight training for the first time?
I'm so happy that this question came in. I used to see this a lot in the clinic, and didn't know that you had diastasis recti. But often, you only know about it after you've given birth, right? Like it's obviously develops during pregnancy, but because the abdomen is so stretched, throughout the pregnancy, we only really see it afterwards. So this is diagnosed, as you mentioned, physical therapist, a chiropractor, any type of body worker, osteopath, even massage therapist, if they're familiar with it. And so just by way of signs and symptoms for any of the moms that are listening here, it's basically almost like a visible coning or pooching, let's say, of the abdomen or the abdominal muscles when you are flexing them. So it's usually right around the belly button, either like immediately right above or immediately right below. If you kind of, palpate or push into the belly button, it kind of feels like soft jelly like, when it should be there should be sort of a hard end feel there. Other women will the separation itself isn't painful, but some of the knock-on effects, like pain during sex, or not being able to pick up the baby or pick up laundry or pick up heavy items, like those can feel like there can be a lot of instability, like a feeling of instability and potentially pain there as well. What I would typically do for patients here is first to recognize what you can't, or let's say what you shouldn't be doing. So I understand that this question is, I want to start weight training. Generally, what we want to do first is rehabilitate the separation in the abdomen. So I wouldn't recommend, so things like squats and lunges and crunches and anything where you're like a push up or any type of pushing motion where there's an increase in abdominal pressure. So, we've all seen, like, I don't have one yet, but the belts that people wear during squatting or lunging, that kind of thing, because what's happening is they're putting a lot of abdominal pressure against the belt, let's say, as they're coming down into the squat. This is a big no-no for women with diastasis recti. So no, unfortunately, it's like the answer here is like no weight training, no load bearing until we can actually strengthen it. So one of the things I would love to do in clinic, and I still recommend it, is something called hypopressives. So this is basically, if you think about almost like sucking in your stomach as much as you can and holding it, this is activating some of the deep muscles of the abdominal musculature. So instead of, let's say, the rectus abdominis, you're activating the transverse abdominis, some of these deeper muscles of the core, to help provide some stability there. Things like pelvic tilt, glute bridge, bird dog. So that's like, you're on all fours. And then if you're watching this on video, it'll be like one arm is extending and then the opposite leg is extending. And then again, you're trying to counteract the forces of gravity and your center of mass through some of these sort of deeper abdominal muscles. But weight training is a contraindication to this, because you will make it worse, because what's happening is you have this weakness between some of the connective tissue of each side of the abdominis recti. Generally is the muscle that's the muscle group that's affected. And if you are going into the squats and the lunges and the chest presses and anything where you are bearing down, or there's any type of increase in abdominal pressure, you're going to make it worse. So the rehab is important prior to doing that. So I would see a physical therapist, see your chiropractor, particularly physical therapists and chiropractors who have specialty training in pregnancy, postpartum, usually pediatrics as well. Like they kind of all go hand in hand in terms of the course material. So if you have a physical therapist, let's say a pelvic floor physical therapist, they've taken extra training, extra courses in terms of how to understand, because the pelvic floor, again, part of the core, they're going to be able to direct you. Same with chiropractors who have had specialty training in perinatal care. And then I would say also just look, you can Google YouTube, let's say, for hypopressives. They're so simple, but they're so effective. And I would even say, even if you don't have diastasis recti and you want to improve core function and that sort of neuromuscular connection to the core, these hypopressive activities are my favorite. So that's where I would start. And I've seen enough women to know, like, that have had this problem sort of postnatally, that hypopressives are like, they're kind of the juice, like they're the special sauce for rehab.
Hey, I learned a new word this afternoon. This is super exciting. And I think for a lot of listeners, because we do have listeners outside the United States and Canada, that it is the standard of care postpartum for women to do pelvic floor rehab. And yet here in the United States, by the time someone gets to a pelvic floor specialist, they probably have gone through quite a bit, whether or not it's been from the diastasis or incontinence or other weakening of the pelvic floor muscles. And I've had so many girlfriends who've had very large vaginal deliveries or long, prolonged labors that end up with quite a bit of pelvic floor dysfunction. And just know, if you are listening to this podcast, there are ways to address these things. As you mentioned, pelvic floor specialists, which can include physical therapists, chiropractors. You don't have to suffer
I'm so glad this question was answered, because what I see a lot online are well-meaning people showing women that, oh yeah, you should be doing crunches to help repair your diastasis. And, from what you are explaining, that's actually going to exacerbate things.
It will make it worse. And I think it's part of a larger conversation around like, okay, I've had the baby. Now I got to get my pre-baby body back. I got to like jump back into it's like, you've just made a human. Can we be, can we be loving, and can you give yourself some grace and allow yourself to heal? Like I had two children within 2 years of each other. First baby was 8 pounds 3, second baby 9 pounds 1. I didn't walk. Like I didn't walk after that second one. I was, I had trouble walking. It was a big baby. And so I think doing I always like prehab, like I like prehabilitation, but if you haven't done that, then like take the time to do the rehabilitation, get yourself back to a place of strength and stability, so that when you are ready for the weights, which I guarantee that you will be, because your body is amazing and it has an infinite capacity for healing, that you're not going to injure yourself and slow it down, because by the time you get there, you're just going to want to go. Like if you get injured, this is going to be so disheartening, so disappointing. And at some point, you're going to have to stop and do the rehab anyway. So do it first, do it properly, get it out of the way so that you develop that core stability, strength, and neuromuscular connection to the core pelvic floor, which is basically diaphragm. Like the core is, diaphragm to pelvic floor. And then have a blast in the gym doing all the other things that make you happy.
Yeah. And I think that's so important. I think that there's a lack of understanding for what happens to our bodies in the postpartum stage, that there's so much pressure on women, whether it's self-imposed or externally, to return to a particular state of being really quickly, because we see people on social media or celebrities that have a full-time chef and a personal trainer probably lives with them, and they probably have help.
And they're starving.
And they're starving themselves to get back to this pre-pregnancy body, which I loved the whole time when I was breastfeeding and I was not working and I was in that maternity leave time period. And I savored so much of that connection with my babies and bonding and all of those things. And that's what we should be focused on, is just savoring that time, that special time that, you get in that postpartum period. But, I think we can get detracted from what the most important things are very easily.
Yeah, agreed.
Next, really great question. What are your thoughts on the Gardasil vaccine? Are we culturally conditioned to think we should get every vaccine? It's hard to find unbiased information. This is from Stephanie.
Well, woman with the best name ever. No, Stephanie. This is a good question. All right. So I'm going to say that, like everything in healthcare, you have to assess your individual risk. So that means your age, that means your chromosomal sex, that means your metabolic health, that means the likelihood of catching the disease, like the wild type, let's say. And you have to weigh the benefits and risks against catching the wild type. What's the mortality risk there versus being inoculated or artificially inoculated with a vaccine. So with the Gardasil vaccine specifically, we're talking about human papillomavirus. I can't speak for everyone. I'm going to speak for myself and say that I remember when I was at my OB, my checkup, and we were talking, and I said to her, okay, so what are the risks for me? Because she was recommending that I get this shot. And I said, what are the risks for me in terms of this turning into cervical cancer? Let's say if I have HPV turning into cervical cancer. And she just like deadpan looked me in the face and she's like 4%. I was like, all right. So 96%, I have a 96% chance that this is not going to turn into a malignant, potentially fatal disease. So I think that, so for me, that choice was very easy, right? It's like 4%, 96%. I'm going to go with the 96%. I also am taking into account my own genetics. I'm taking into account my health, all of that kind of thing. I have how many sexual partners I've had. Not the most exciting in that category. I've only had a few. So, I don't necessarily I'm not, my risk is very low. We'll say it that way. So for me, it was a really easy choice. Where I think we go wrong, and I think to Stephanie's point, this listener's point, is that, and we've seen this kind of in recent years with the pandemic, is that it seems like the narrative has shifted from, let's talk about your individual risk, let's talk about your genetics, let's talk about how this might either positively or negatively impact you, to everybody needs it, bar none. There's no other way to stay healthy. And that's sort of where I myself will push back a little bit and say, hey, consensus medicine isn't medicine. That's just everybody agreeing so everybody can keep their license, right? So we want to think about individual risk, and we want to think about cost benefit, right? So if I get it, what is the cost and what's the benefit? And if I don't get it, what's the cost and what's the benefit? And you have to be able to weigh that out. I'm very blessed that my team, I have a very open and honest conversation with my medical team, and they're very open to, let's say, alternatives that they may not have been, let's say, exposed to, or have not from, with the mass population. I'm always bringing in studies and things like that. So I'm that patient. So I'm very blessed that I can have there's a dialogue. It's not a monologue with my healthcare providers, but that's also part of the reason why I do the work that I do, is to help other women be able to go in and feel empowered to say, hey, can we have a conversation about risk? Like, I want you to be able to talk to me about what are some of the real risks here and what are some of the real benefits. And I think that I've, being a guest on your show before and also listening to your podcast, I know that you're also sort of a beacon for informed consent as well. And that's sort of the definition of what I'm describing here. Informed consent is having a good understanding of the benefits as well as the risks. And then the patient makes an informed decision because she knows or he knows, all the benefits, all the risks, and then what is best for him or her.
I can't think of a more thoughtful response, Stephanie, in all honesty. And I knew that if I asked this question that had been posed by our listeners and followers, that you would have an incredibly well thought out, respectful response. And probably something the listeners don't know is that when I trained at Hopkins many years ago, my GYN was one of the researchers, Dr. Connie Trimble. She was one of the researchers working with NIH on these vaccines. And at that time, the thought process was, this is going to save a lot of lives. What I think is really interesting is if you look at cervical cancer in relationship to other types of cancers, it tends to be a very slow growing cancer, meaning if you're getting pap smears on regular intervals based on, again, your own bio-individual needs and what stage of life you're in, et cetera, this tends to be something that is caught pretty readily and pretty easily.
And often.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so again, to Stephanie's point, looking at your individual needs, looking at, the cost benefit analysis, talking openly with your healthcare practitioner and deciding if it's the right decision for you.
Yeah.
So many good questions.
There were so many good questions. There were amazing questions. Your assistant sent them to me last night, and I was like, wow, we're going to have a good conversation. Yeah,
absolutely. So I have to say, bravo to the listeners and to Stephanie's listeners as well, that we got so many well thought out. Like, I could tell people were thoughtfully asking these questions. Okay. We're pivoting a little bit to what recommendations would you have for a Hashimoto's patient that is trying to naturally balance hormones, but still has low estrogen? And Brittany is childbearing years in her 30s with symptoms affecting hair, skin, and nails with normal thyroid panels.
Yeah, I read this one and I had so many questions. I was like, what do you mean by normal thyroid panels? You have Hashimoto's and you have normal thyroid panels. Okay, so to expand on what I'm talking about. So I'm not sure what labs she's looking at. So when she says normal thyroid panels, I'm hoping that she's obviously including TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone. Maybe she's looking at her T3 and her T4 levels. A full thyroid panel is also going to look at reverse T3, which tends to be a little bit higher in our Hashimoto's patients. And also maybe even looking at the ratio of T3 to reverse T3. We want to look at that. And then of course the autoantibodies, right? So the TPOs and the thyroid the antibodies as well. So those are kind of the two antibodies that are an auto antibody. When I say same as antibody, just means self-directed. So I would want to, like, are those normal too? That was my question. Like when you say normal, because so many times when you go to we'll say a traditional allopathic physician for thyroid specifically, I hear this all the time. I'm sure you hear this all the time, Cynthia, that most women have to fight to get an extended or full thyroid panel. Like many doctors who are not educated fully, let's say, on lab diagnosis or even just thyroid function, will just look at TSH, T3, T4. Maybe they'll look at free T4, free T3 as well. But the reverse T3, the autoantibodies, they're not really looking at. So I'm going to make an assumption, and I'm going to assume that she doesn't necessarily have access to her autoantibodies potentially. And I'll say that thyroid generally, when we're thinking about healing the thyroid, I think there's another question in there around like, can I fully heal my thyroid or get off my dependency or something like that with lifestyle interventions alone? But I would say when I've seen a lot of Hashimoto's patients, there's sort of two main verticals that I look at. One is their conversion. So this is something where, so the thyroid is going to produce mainly like 93-ish% of inactive thyroid. So it produces something called T4, which does nothing in the body. It's inert. We need to actually cleave one of those bonds to make it T3. But that conversion from T4 to T3 is the active thyroid hormone. That's the thing that's actively helping the cells take substrate up and produce ATP, is done in the liver, it's done in the heart, it's done in the skeletal muscle, it's done sort of peripherally. Okay. So the liver is actually where I will usually zoom into, because that's where 60% of the conversion in the body happens, is in the liver. So we want to be looking at optimizing this woman's liver detoxification pathways. And of course, thyroid and estrogen, they're sort of besties, right? So when we have low thyroid, we tend to also have, either low estrogen or estrogen goes unchecked. So, and in the liver is where, when we are optimizing liver detoxification, is where we can also very positively influence estrogen metabolism as well. So I would be looking at liver detoxification. So is she, and I don't know how detailed you want to go here, Cynthia, but I would say there's three main parts to detoxification. There's hydroxylation, conjugation, and elimination. So hydroxylation, just a fancy word for like sticking an OH group on the metabolite. Okay. Conjugation is sort of how we eliminate. There's different areas, different enzymes. There's COMT, there's glucuronidation. We won't go there, but it's influenced. We can influence it with sulforaphanes, which are from compounds from green leafy vegetables. And then there's elimination, right? So in the gut, right? So do we have the appropriate amount of species in the gut, either the microbiome, and it's primarily the microbiome, but there's also the mycobiome and other kingdoms in the gut that are allowing for the estrogen to be appropriately metabolized. I'm sure you've talked about the estrobolome on the show before, which is kind of the species in the gut that are specifically involved in metabolizing estrogen, right? So, and of course, the golden rule of estrogen: use it and then lose it, right? So we want the gut to be able to kind of get rid of it and not to deconjugate it so that it comes back into the system and circulates. Now, when we're talking about low estrogen, I think she said low estrogen.
Yes.
Particularly, right? So we want to be thinking about, okay, so what are some of the things that causes low estrogen? One is age, which I don't think she was in her 30s.
Yeah. So the childbearing years, 30s. So I'm assuming early, mid.
Yeah. So age here, you shouldn't have low estrogen in your 30s. If anything, most women are dealing with an excess or an abundance of. Other things we want to think about with low estrogen are eating disorders or a history of eating disorders, right? So things like anorexia and bulimia, where you're essentially depriving your body of certainly calories, but of course in those calories are nutrients that are going to help keep your hormone levels balanced. She also might be dealing with POI, or primary ovarian insufficiency, which is kind of what happens to women in perimenopause in kind of their 40s. But this, where we see like these fluctuating hormonal levels, we see hot flashes, we see low levels of hormones like estrogen. But with POI, we're actually seeing it prior to 40, right? So that there might be something there, either genetically determined, stress determined as well from her history. That might be something to explore. Couple other things that I put on like my DDX hat, right? I'm like, what are my differential diagnoses? Like what are all the things I can have? So the other obviously things like, I don't think she mentioned this, but like chemotherapy, medications can also affect estrogens essentially as well. So chemotherapy can damage the ovaries, oophorectomies. I don't think she mentioned that, but just for completion, for the answer for your listeners. And then the other thing, I was kind of alluding to it, but hypothalamic amenorrhea. So if she is excessive, there's like this, I call this like the deadly triad. If she's exercising too much, she's overly restricting her calories, right? And she's fasting too aggressively, we can run into this HA, this hypothalamic amenorrhea, where the pituitary gland essentially, like you're basically not getting enough nutrients, and your brain is not going to be releasing enough of the hormones that are going to essentially, cascade down in the production of estrogen. And there's too much cortisol. So those would sort of be like where I would be, which puzzle piece sort of best fits her clinical picture. And then we might explore from there. But often when we have thyroid dysfunction, more often than not, we're going to have estrogen dysfunction as well. So in her case, she's already displaying that. So I would want to first understand what's the full picture for the thyroid, because I don't think we fully know that. If she said her labs are normal, but she has Hashimoto's thyroiditis, like those two are almost competing answers, right? It's almost an oxymoron. Like you can't, that doesn't really go. And then what might be some secondary or tertiary reasons why estrogen might be low. So the POI, the hypothalamic amenorrhea, history of eating disorders, excessive cardio, excessive caloric restriction, all the things.
I'm so glad you brought up the triad, because I speak to this triad often,
Yes.
to the point where it's now become a daily conversation, because I'm sure you see these women as well. It's like it starts as a well-meaning habit of fasting and exercise, and then all of a sudden it's this role of hormetic stress, and it can just be like a train that's out of control. All of a sudden they don't know how to get ahead of it.
Yeah.
And when I read this question, I kept thinking, is she on oral contraceptives? Because when we talk about this concept of informed consent, well-meaning practitioners many years ago, I was started on oral contraceptives, very likely because I had mild thin phenotype PCOS and wasn't having regular cycles. No, this will help fix it. And if you miss opportunities to have, when you're in your peak bone building years and your estrogen is so suppressed, the net impact of that. So when I was reading this, I was reading it from that lens, thinking maybe this is a young woman who has been on oral contraceptives and could be in this low estradiol state. But I think that, from what both of us are kind of alluding to, Brittany, a little bit more information. You may know that maybe your antibody numbers are negative and you're stable on medication, but we don't have enough information to be able to completely flesh out the answer. But this certainly will give you some directions to move into to get a better sense of what the next step should be.
Yep.
And tying into our thyroid question, this is from Jessica. You are both a wealth of knowledge. Thank you. I've learned so much from your podcast and books. My question is regarding low iodine. I have Hashimoto's and hypothyroidism. It is under control and my numbers look great. However, my iodine came back on the low end. I cannot eat seafood. It makes me physically ill. My integrative doc put me on iodine supplements, and I've read that it can cause more harm than good. Could I supplement with kelp supplements, or would that be similar to the iodine supplement? I'm struggling with where to go from here to tackle this. Thank you so much.
I mean, the short answer is yes. I think she can. I mean, I think she can certainly try kelp supplementation. I think iodine is one of those Goldilocks, we don't want too little, we don't want too much, we want it just right. So you can certainly overdo it. I would say chances are, I don't know where she lives, but chances are she's probably getting enough iodine from her salt, if she even table salt, even just regular old table salt, but Himalayan salt and the super special flakes and all the the kind of gourmet salts, those are also very good sources of iodine, we'll say. But sure, she can try kelp supplements. I think that would be, wonderful. I think anytime you have low thyroid function, considering iodine supplementation is wise, but you absolutely have to be monitoring that with your primary healthcare provider, because you can completely overdo it. And then we have a whole other cascade we have other issues that can pop up with too much iodine as well. So yeah, the short answer is try the kelp. And part of healthcare is there's a science to it, but there's also an art, right? So we can understand the mechanisms and we can say, okay, and iodine and L-tyrosine and all these different, we can talk about all of these different mechanisms. But at the end of the day, there has to be an element of play and experimentation and creativity that is infused into our patient care to see what works, because of this little thing called bioindividuality. It's kind of maybe the theme so far in some of these questions that have been coming up. But we want to be thinking about, how do you individually respond to it? Like the iodine supplements might be fine. Maybe her fear around it is that she may be overdoing it. So you want to make sure that you and your functional medicine provider, it looks like, our integrative doc, are monitoring your iodine levels. And then if that isn't working for you, then maybe you can try something like a kelp, a supplement. I think that's absolutely, yes, absolutely yes.
Well, and it's interesting because I feel as if iodine as a topic in the functional and integrative medicine space, it tends to be one camp or another.
It's so true.
Pro iodine, anti-iodine, and there's no in between. So is it any surprise that patients are confused as to what they should be doing?
Yeah. Yeah. It's so true. I mean, you sort of see that with a few different verticals in health. You see that with like hormone replacement therapy. So estrogen's either the devil or it's the best. Testosterone's either the devil or it's the best. You see it with cholesterol. You see it with certainly how to treat is it desiccated thyroid? Is it is it T3 hormone? Like what are we doing? Synthroid, Levoxy. So yeah, there's certainly quite a bit of debate, and there's lots of different ways, lots of different roads to roam. So I would say feel free to have the flexibility of thought to experiment, and what you measure, you manage. So measure your iodine levels, watch your thyroid, and see how you respond to some of the different stimuli that you're playing with.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I think that it's been my clinical experience. Now I have well-controlled Hashimoto's, negative antibodies. I'm on compounded T4 and T3. I talk about this a lot. And it's interesting. I'm seeing a new functional medicine provider who is the best listener I've ever worked with. And so he's very thoughtful. And we had this long conversation about iodine. And he said, I just want you to try the drops. Just try them. And so right now I'm doing fine. And we're monitoring my levels. And actually my iodine has improved. But I do know if there's a hesitancy, if someone doesn't intrinsically feel that supplementation is the way to go, I think food-based sources is certainly reasonable. Sure. And just make sure if you're having kelp or having seaweed that you're sourcing it from a place where there's less contamination. And there are definitely resources we can include in the show notes, but that's the one thing I would say is just try to make sure you're not having it harvested from outside of Japan or, that part of Asia where there's still quite a bit of radiation from Fukushima. Mm. Okay.
That's a really good point. I didn't even think of
that. But that's the rabbit hole that I go down. It's like, okay, if I'm going to think about it, then it's like I go down this massive rabbit hole and then I'm like, I need to find my way back. Okay. Yeah. This is the last question about thyroid, but again, such thoughtful question. This is from Maria. Can you reverse your need for thyroid medication with diet alone?
Diet alone. So I've worked with lots of women who have reduced their need for thyroid medication from diet. Well, it's not just diet. I've seen sort of a whole lifestyle overhaul. So we are looking at stress management. The other thing I'll say, and I actually would love to know what your thoughts are on here on this as well. I often find autoimmune diseases as a general category. So within that, of course, we're including Hashimoto's thyroiditis. I would say that there is an element of, how will I say it? Sympathetic dominance and trauma or stress that is still leaving a residue on the system. And when, most women who have any type of autoimmune disease, there's usually has been a difficult upbringing. There's been a difficult relationship, let's say with a mother, a father, an ex-husband, an ex-partner, something like that, where they're naturally just a little bit more on edge. When you really get into it, there's a couple of questions that I'll ask. Like when you walk into a room, are you sort of just planning, like, are you looking where all the windows are and the exits? Like, are you planning your exit? Like when you walk into a room, like that kind of level of frenetic, a more frenetic way of being, I'll say. And it's with most of my autoimmune. So it's not just Hashimoto's, but I've noticed this with multiple my MS patients. Worked with some lupus patients as well, where it's kind of the same thing, where there's been some kind of really strong stress signal at some point in the life where their response to it has been to completely internalize it because maybe they were too young, or they didn't have the skills or the tools at the time to figure out how to deal with it. And so that kind of leaves the system always revving, right? So if we think about the proverbial car, right, the foot's always on the gas, it's always on the sympathetic, we're always in drive mode. So I say that because yes, you can completely reduce your dependence off of medication, but it's hard work because one of the levers that needs to be, we'll say, pulled well and into position is the stress management piece. So really understanding what your triggers or, what activates you, what kind of gets you sort of going or nervous or anxious, and working on that. And that's actually the hard work, because I can give you the diet and I can give you the exercises and I'm going to tell you to lift heavy and all of those things, which someone with Hashimoto's can probably punch out relatively easily. But it's the stress piece, like looking back in the history of that usually woman's life, although men, I have worked with men as well, but it happens, I think, 8 times more frequently in women. Generally, autoimmune disease is like 8 to 10 more times more frequent in women. So there's been some kind of unresolved trauma or stressor where the individual maybe at the time didn't have the skills to process the stimulus. So yes, you can, but it's a lot of work, but it's worthy work, right? You are worth investing in. So is it worth the introspection and the unraveling of some of these stories and belief structures these sort of neural networks that we've created? Absolutely. Absolutely worth the time. You're absolutely worth the effort. Is it easy? No. But have I seen it happen? Hundreds of times.
That's really encouraging. And I think for listeners, if they're following what Stephanie is referring to, so adverse childhood events, we know that if you have a great deal of adverse childhood events, you are at greater risk for not only autoimmune conditions, but also weight loss resistance. And I don't know that we fully understand that mechanism, but last year I had the honor of connecting with Dr. Gabor Mate. I've been very open about the degree of abuse I dealt with as a child and young adult. And, in my training, it was like big T trauma. And so I didn't experience big T trauma. So I didn't recognize trauma for what it was. And so trauma is a wound. But those of us that have experienced quite a bit of trauma as young people are more at risk for autoimmune conditions. And so I've had several throughout my lifetime, but I think it brings up such a good point of this revved up autonomic nervous system in the direction of this sympathetic response. Like, you may feel calm, but your body doesn't perceive that you're safe. And so this chronic activation of the sympathetic nervous system can really impact our health in pretty profound ways. So if nothing else, this lifestyle piece, if you have an autoimmune condition, is so important to get a hold of. And as easy as it would be to say 5 minutes of meditation once a week will help with that, it's really doing that deep inner work that can really get you to a point where you could be in remission. It's always my hope that people don't need to be on medication. I did that. I did all the work, all the lifestyle piece, still need a little bit of medication, and that's okay. If you need to be on medication, that's okay.
Yes. Yes.
But absolutely the lifestyle piece really needs to be better and more proactively addressed, because it's very easy to prescribe a medication. It's a whole lot harder to make all those lifestyle changes. And I know that they're challenging to do. They're not meant to be easy, but over time, the net benefits can really just be amplified.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for sharing with your audience, your experiences, because I think it's very easy to look at someone who's as accomplished as you are and put together and well-spoken and, all the accolades that you have, and almost put you up on a pedestal. Like, she can't even be human. Like, she just must be this Wonder Woman that's able to get what puts her mind to something, gets it done and gets her done. And I think that when we are, first, this is one of my favorite quotes from Ted Lasso. First, the truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off, right? So that's the first thing. And I think when you do that, right, when you are so open and honest and transparent with your community, it allows for introspection from on the listener side to say, oh, okay, so Cynthia's describing that, this scenario that she maybe is there anything in that story that sounds like me? And it gives other people permission to also explore their own past and how their past might have some of that residue, let's say, that's showing up in the present. And I just want to applaud you for that, because I think that it's really difficult when you have the audience and the platform that you do to be real. And we see this. You and I kind of see this, right? You see big platform people and they look very scripted, and they have sort of like the talking points that they have, and they have the talking points that they have, and they never go off of that sort of, script that they've been given or that they're telling to the world. So I think that that's so admirable, that you're doing that. And I think I can tell you, I've talked similarly. I don't talk about it a ton, but I've talked a little bit about it on the podcast. I'm a slow learner, so I am still, coming into my own comfort around talking about some of these things. But what's been incredibly helpful for me is like psilocybins and, mushrooms. And I've explored some other psychedelics that I've talked about on the show, but mushrooms I find are gentle and loving, and they're wonderful for me. So I found that to be very, very helpful in me having we'll say, safety to explore some of those memories and look at the memory. One of the things that I've talked about is, I heard this, I can't remember where I heard it, and I wish I could remember, but it's almost like you go from being an actor in the play to being in the audience, right? So instead of mom or dad or scary gentleman in the alleyway, whatever, and all of those things are happening to you, now you can sort of remove yourself and you're a third person. And you're like, oh, okay, I see that the father, this was how he was raised, and these were some of his belief systems, and that's why he was reacting to her in the way that he did, right? That kind of thing. So I've moved from being more like first person for things happening to me to being able to sort of see the entire play and all the actors and all the drivers. That's what I will say, like, psychedelics have really helped me with that, because it was very difficult for me before that. It was very much, it's always my fault. I was the reason why I couldn't keep my marriage together. It was, I didn't do enough for, all the things, right? Versus kind of looking at the totality of the scenario and being able to kind of look at everyone's contribution to the problem.
Well, I think all of our journeys are so important and impactful. And thank you I receive your kind words, and also reflect back on you, the work that you have done to get yourself into a more compassionate view of yourself. I think that so much of our experiences, they are what they are. But, I think a great deal, reflect a great deal on Gabor's book, because for me, I was ready to do the work. I'd been in therapy, I'd done Reiki work, I'd done all this energy work. I was ready to read that book. And I walked away with a degree of profound compassion for my parents, and the recognition that so many of us sometimes are just doing the very best we can.
Right.
And that's okay.
Right.
But anyway.
Well said.
Yeah. Yes.
Aren't we all, right?
Yes.
Are we all just doing the best that, like, my kids, someday they're going to be on a couch talking about
all the time.
my mother, my high achieving, driven type A mother. And this is what she did to me. It's going to happen too.
Exactly. Although it's interesting. I'm in a place where my 17-year-old has his first girlfriend, and she's absolutely lovely. And last night we met her parents, and they are absolutely lovely. And this young woman's mother and I were having this really nice conversation. And I said, I am so grateful that I get to see the wonderful young man my husband and I have, in kind of impressed upon him healthy relationships and communication and growing up in a loving, quiet, peaceful home, because I get to see the amazing young man he is, and he's dating your daughter, who is equally wonderful and lovely. And I just said, I'm just so at peace. I know a lot of parents get stressed when their kids start dating, and yet I'm completely at peace because I can look objectively at this young couple they communicate really well. They're respectful of one another. They, very clearly, they care about each other enormously. And I'm like, sometimes I think we forget how much we imprint upon our children. But for me, being able to feel at peace and very, very grateful that I'm like, okay, I can look and see that we've done a lot of the work, and I can see this in my children. And so just want to close that loop. Okay.
I love that mom brag. I love it. I love it. I love it. That's great.
No, but it's one of those things that I think I don't talk a lot about the kids on the podcast, because they're now teenagers, and everything I do is embarrassing, and I'm embarrassed. I mean, it's just what normal teenagers think of their parents.
For sure.
And so I always tell them I'm very respectful of your privacy, but this is one of those things I can say objectively. I'm very proud of the young man that he's becoming.
They end up dating what they see at home. Right. So, and I say this in a loving way, like, that's such an awesome mom brag. First of all, I don't think women brag about themselves enough. So that's one thing. So I'm so proud that you did that. The other thing is, your son, their first relationship with the opposite sex is you. So if you are doing the work and you are modeling what it's like to be an adult female who sometimes makes mistakes and can recognize those mistakes and have conversations about those mistakes. And it's not a totalitarian, like, because I said so, that's why. And if you're wrong, you never apologize. Like, one of the things that we do in my family is, can I get a redo? Like, I messed up, or mommy's really tired, or, I misinterpreted the situation entirely. Can we get a redo? And so they do that now too. They're like, Mom, can I get a redo? Like, I know that I hit my brother or whatever it is, but can I get a redo? And then there's like some hugging. And so I think that the success that you're going to see now with your son is in part because of the work that you and your partner, you and your husband, have also put into yourselves and your own dedication to growth as well.
Well, thank you. And I love the redo. I may have to borrow that, but I definitely, one thing I have consciously done is being, even when and because they're all teenagers, when they don't want to talk to me, I'm still going to come in. I'm still going to say goodnight. I may sit on your bed occasionally. We're going to have a conversation. And so understanding that as our kids are getting older, our relationships change, not necessarily in bad ways, but meeting them where they are.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people, when they get to the teenage stage, they're like, they're jerks. I don't want to deal with them. I'm like, yes, they can be a jerk. We can be jerks too, but we have to acknowledge, like, you're an adult, they're a child still. You have to kind of meet them where they are and make sure that communication piece is still ongoing. Well, okay. This is a question from Elizabeth. What is the ideal percentage of body fat for perimenopause and menopausal women that bodes the best for an increased health span? Such a good question.
Such a good question. I think that, first of all, we want to think about, well, we'll say it this way. There's a certain amount of women are going to have a higher percentage of body fat than our male counterparts do. And that's whether we are in our fertile years, whether we are in perimenopause, which is still considered our fertile years, and then menopausal as well. So the body has an essential kind of baseline of fat. Like you need about somewhere between 10 to call it 14% of your body weight is going to be adipose tissue. I would say I would say 14 to call it 24%. So on the low end, I would think 14 is more like an athlete, sort of a high performing athlete. I would say most women who enjoy fitness and who are lifting weights and sort of want that kind of fitness look, you're probably going to clock in somewhere between 18 and 21%, but then a little bit of padding on either side. So up to about 24%, I think is wonderful. And then, 14 to 18%, height is important there as well. Like how tall are you? And a couple of other, a couple of other factors, but I would say generally, ideally you want to keep your body fat under a quarter. We'll say it that way. So somewhere between 14 and 24%. And the more optimal range we'll say to kind of stick to is somewhere between 18 and 21, 22.
Yeah. And it's interesting that there's so many things that impact our body fat percentage throughout our lifetime. And obviously pregnancy, we're going to have more body fat, and that is a natural process. And for many women, as they're north of 40 and we're losing muscle mass and we're gaining more adipose tissue and understanding the role of sarcopenia and fluctuations in sex hormones. And I almost feel like when I really look at what hormones can be the most impactful on body fat, I think a lot about insulin and cortisol and testosterone in particular, because if you're chronically stressed, a lot of the themes we've been talking about is managing your stress. So chronically stressed, if cortisol is elevated, your blood sugar is elevated, correspondingly, your insulin will go up, and helping people understand that things like meal frequency and how good or not good your sleep quality is and how you manage your stress. And do you do chronic cardio or are you lifting weights? Common theme, make sure you're strength training to maintain that muscle mass and build on it. Inflammatory foods that people are consuming, a lot of these things. I think a lot about alcohol, and we talk very openly on the podcast about, gluten and dairy, depending on the individual, and alcohol and sugar, and how a lot of these things that seem fairly benign can, send that body fat percentage to a degree that many women don't desire it to be so. So it's helping people understand that there's a lot at play in terms of ideal body fat percentages, which if you are a fitness competitor or an athlete, you're probably going to be a bit on the leaner side. But I would say most people, if they've got a fairly healthy lifestyle, should be within that range. And it's not at all uncommon for women in the latter stages of perimenopause and early menopause years to put on 5, 10, 15, 20 pounds. And some of that is hormonally mediated. And it's also a reflection of these changes in body fat relative to muscle mass and how that can impact insulin sensitivity and other factors. But one thing that I do think, not every woman that goes into menopause stops making testosterone. There are about 25% of women that still have vibrant testosterone levels in menopause, which is another reason why not everyone needs more supplementally or compounded testosterone. But helping women understand that sometimes it's the loss of testosterone that can change body composition significantly. And so just keeping that in the back of people's minds, I think that the conversations around HRT can range from one extreme to another, but since testosterone is not FDA approved per se for women, which I think is problematic. There are compounding pharmacies that can make it, but I was talking to a physician the other day and she was saying that, with the pandemic and all this telemedicine that people have been doing, that the FDA is now really cracking down on testosterone prescriptions. So be interesting to see how that changes. But I know that hormone piece and the lifestyle piece definitely plays quite a significant role in how lean or not lean an individual is at that stage.
Yeah, you brought up two very important points that I think are worth highlighting, which is the insulin regulation piece and the cortisol piece. So we've kind of been talking a little bit about that through the show, but I would say naturally, as you mentioned, as we age, we naturally become more insulin resistant as we age. So if you don't have strategies to actively overcome that, you know, things like weight training, which where we see insulin resistance actually settling in first tends to be in the musculoskeletal system. So in the muscles and in the bones and in the ligaments, we usually can overcome that by 1 or 2 sessions of weight training. Like the muscle becomes like orders of magnitude more sensitive. So the GLUT4, so without getting like too geeky, but we have like the GLUT4, the GLUT4 receptor is able to express itself on the surface of the muscle cell much easier, which is a way for it to take glucose passively in to the muscle cell, and then it gets phosphorylated, blah, blah, blah. And then it's used for energy there. So when we're weight training, this is a way for us to become better glucose disposal agents. And then the other variable to sort of manipulate in terms of overcoming insulin resistance is to reduce your carbohydrates, either transiently or cyclically, right? So we can reduce our carbohydrate intake. Fasting is another way. That's like total caloric restriction, right? If we're kind of bringing everything down, so you're going to naturally become more insulin sensitive. So things like a female-centric, maybe ketogenic diet, or some healthy and sustainable, easy fasting, not like 72 hours of like, I don't want someone listening to me like, that's it, I'm not going to eat for the next week. That's not the takeaway here. That's not the takeaway. The takeaway is gentle fasting for a woman has been shown to improve insulin sensitization systemically, like throughout the entire body. So that's really important. And then the other piece that you said was sort of the cortisol and the adrenal piece. These are like the first 2 dominoes that have to be put in check. It's like the insulin sensitivity and then the cortisol output by the adrenals. So again, we've kind of been talking about it with the trauma and the ACE, the adverse childhood experiences, and trauma, big T trauma, little t trauma. But certainly stress management, finding something that works for you. Like you mentioned, I know we were on another question before, but you said, sometimes the meditation for 10 minutes doesn't work. I personally have a lot of I'm going to be very open and honest here. I have a lot of limbic resistance to meditation. I always feel good when I do it, but I do mental jumping jacks in order to get out of it. And I don't know why. So I find things like getting out in the sun in the morning and doing a walk. I find that very calming for me. Even just standing outside, taking my slippers off and standing in my backyard, my grass, I find that to be very therapeutic. So there's lots of different ways that we can attenuate or pull down our stress response, like meditation, certainly one of them. Another one that I actually use a lot with clients is yoga nidra, or non-sleep deep rest. So I have no limbic resistance to this. You just lie down and you listen to something and it's like, there, I've done my yoga for the day.
Yep. No, it's delicious.
Delicious. That's a great word for it. So that's another way that we can think about managing our stress to your point around, body fat levels or adipose levels kind of changing as we move into perimenopause and then later on in menopause. Those are some really great strategies. I think most women should be thinking about first as a first order of operations.
That's a good point. And I love that you brought up yoga nidra. I'm in a new city, and my previous yoga studio that I love, they would do yoga nidra like twice a month. And my husband would jokingly call it my nap time, because I would go and I was like, you don't understand. It's the most wonderful, delicious experience. I wake up and I'm refreshed and I feel great and I fall asleep easily when I get home. I want to make sure that I'm respectful of your time. So we're just going to go over 2 more questions, and anything we didn't address in this podcast, I will make sure I address on social media. This is a question from Allie. Is it normal for period cramps and general PMS symptoms to grow worse with age? I'm 35 and have a copper IUD, and I've noticed more painful periods and more PMS, tender breasts, and irritability in the days leading up to it.
All right. So we got a copper IUD in here. So if there's a favorite contraception that I have, it's the copper IUD, because we are avoiding some of the hormones, the synthetic hormones that are encapsulated in some of the, oral contraceptives or the Mirena for example. And just as an interesting note, the way that it works is copper repels sperm. So as the sperm is kind of swimming it's like, oh my God, that's copper. It's literally their kryptonite. So they will start swimming the other way. Isn't that so amazing?
It is amazing.
Okay. So just for anyone that's like, I wonder how the copper IUD works. It literally repels the sperm. Okay. So for this woman in particular, one of the side effects that we know with the copper IUD, of course, is that it can increase, at least transiently, the heaviness of your flow. So if she is, if this is a recent, let's say, insertion, we know that the flow, like your menstrual flow, so when you're can at least be like 50% higher. Like it can be orders of magnitude more than when you are not using one. So that can lead to things like anemia. And so we want to be really, really mindful of that. That being said, that should level out. Okay, so that shouldn't continue. The other thing to be kind of mindful of is that if you have a copper allergy, right, this can also create this like pro-inflammatory response in the body, which can lead to estrogen dysregulation, which of course is going to lead to kind of heavier bleeding around the time of your menses as well. So when we think about reactions to the copper IUD in general, periods that are heavier or longer than usual, which she seems to be describing, lower abdominal cramps or discomfort, around ovulation, around period time, but also throughout the cycle. You want to be monitoring that as well. And then kind of the other thing I want her to, and she may not have put these together, so I'm just including this in my response just to be thorough, is symptoms of like pelvic inflammatory disease, essentially like pain during sex, fatigue, abnormal discharge from the vagina. So we want to make sure, we want to rule out that those things are not happening. So if the copper IUD is a recent, let's say, insertion, then having a heavier flow around her period transiently, like 4 months-ish, that should be it. After that, it should be normal like usual. If it's still heavy, we also have to, and the other things we have to also consider is that there may be perforation. There may, like when the IUD was inserted, it was inserted incorrectly. So we want to make sure that she's having a conversation with probably the OB who inserted it to make sure, and to have it checked to make sure that it is at least mechanically and anatomically in the right place. And then if it is, and she's still bleeding heavily, we want to be thinking maybe she has a copper allergy, or maybe this is not the contraceptive for her. My absolute favorite type of contraceptive is fertility awareness method. So this is basically tracking your basal body temperature, tracking your cervical fluid over the course of the month. And it has, when it's done correctly, it has a, it's right up there, the 98, 99%, effective. And I would argue that it's a more, I like it better than all of the other methods because it forces you to pay attention to what your body is telling you. When are you warmer? And can we have a masterclass in our cervical fluid, please? Like, it's not just snot that shows up in your underwear. Like it's like, it's telling you something. It's saying, hey, we have more estrogen. Hey, you're about to ovulate. It's kind of sticky and lotionly, egg whitey. That's a signal that ovulation is imminent. So I think that if the copper IUD ends up not being the option for her, I would strongly recommend that she look into FAM as well. That is my favorite way of contraception. If that's indeed the goal, is that she doesn't want to get pregnant. She can learn about the rhythms and her own particular cadence. And I think that relationship that she would develop with herself, I hear this time and time again from women who do the fertility awareness method, is that they just feel like they're better agents for themselves because they know themselves better.
Well, I think it's so important because in many ways, most medications that are used to impact our reproductive health are designed to control the symptom. And in essence, deconstruct or disconnect our awareness of our bodies. So I love that you brought up FAM. And I agree with you wholeheartedly about the copper IUD. I was thinking when I was reading her question was, I think this requires going to your physician who placed it just to make sure, is it in the right place? Did it perforate your uterus? I mean, that does happen on occasion. And is this the best option for you? Because the symptoms shouldn't continue to get worse. They should over time get better. I know that for many people, they want to drop the IUD in and they don't want to think about it again, but it definitely sounds like this is impacting Allie's quality of life quite significantly. Okay. Last question. And there are so many other good questions. And I promise over the weekend, I will get these answered on social media. This is from Magdalena. What would be a good way to support undisturbed sleep? I tend to wake up between 2 a.m. to 4 a.m. only in the luteal phase of the menstrual cycle. As per the Dutch test, progesterone is within the range. Estrogen is slightly below. Testosterone is low. Cortisol is good. I have tried melatonin, 5-HTP, inositol, magnesium, phosphoserine, some botanicals to no success.
So I just want to give this girl a hug.
Yes. It's not fun. Sleep
not
disturbances
fun.
are not fun.
Yeah. So she sounds like she's doing a lot of the right things, a lot of the right supplements. She's gotten the Dutch test, which I'm a fan of. Without knowing her age, maybe even her chronotype, I think that would be also information, useful information, as well. But I would say generally, this is how I would think about sleep hygiene, is that the best quality of your sleep starts the moment that you wake up. So sunlight, getting early morning sunlight, we've been all taught that blue light is the worst, but when the sun is in a low solar angle in the sky, like 6, 7, 8 o'clock, maybe even 9 o'clock in the morning, you're actually getting quite a bit of blue light to the, through the eyes and up to the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the brain, which is going to kind of set off your circadian rhythm. And usually what happens is once you get that early morning light exposure, there's this sort of timer that starts, right? So it's this 14 to 16 hour timer that is going to dictate when you're going to be tired later on. Now, so sunlight, we're just going to get all the kind of fundamental basics out of the way. So we got sunlight. Hopefully she's also engaging in parasympathetic activity. So one of the things that I kind of, with the theme of what we've been talking about today, with some of the super driven, like my autoimmune ladies that are listening, and even if you don't have an autoimmune disease, like if you are a driven type A personality, I'm going to guess that you don't often, or maybe you don't like, or you are not as often as you should taking parasympathetic days. So one of my friends, Ben Pakulski, says, champions don't take days off. They take parasympathetic days, which I love. Speaks to my,
yes.
Isn't that great? It speaks to my type A personality. I was like, yes, I never have to take a day off, but also that I am managing load. So I am going to go for a walk, maybe, instead of berating myself that I didn't have the hardest HIIT workout, cardio workout, whatever it was, right? So champions don't take days off. They take parasympathetic days. That's Ben Pakulski, who's a dear friend of mine and maybe one of the smartest guys that I know. And that applies here as well. So how is she managing her load? If she is in the luteal phase and still pushing the way that she was in her follicular phase, we are going to see sleep aberration. We're going to see sleep changes, right? Follicular phase, whether it's weight training or career or whatever it is a time to push, right? We are more physiologically resistant to things like fasting, to things like the ketogenic diet, to going for PRs in the gym, like lifting your heaviest weights usually happens, or the best time or optimal time to do those things is in the first half of your cycle. So bleed week and pre-ovulation. In the luteal phase, it's time to slow down a little bit. And so if she's still pushing, right, she's still pushing that gas pedal, right, and not the brake, then we're going to start to see that 2 to 4 time that she's describing when she wakes up is when we actually start to see cortisol start to be dripped right into the system. And if her adrenals, again, back to the adrenals, are jacked, right? She's not taking parasympathetic days and she's not working on recovery, then her adrenal glands are going to overcompensate. We're going to overdo the dumping of cortisol, but in that it's usually 2 to 4 in the morning. That's always the time that I hear women are waking up overnight. And so we want to be dialing back the hormetic stress, right? Because hormetic stress, if you do it in excess, is a distress, right? Exercise in and of itself, technically a stressor, right? Blood pressure goes up, thyroid function goes down, immune system transiently goes down as well. Like exercise actually sounds pretty scary. And, if you kind of describe all of the adaptations that happen, and certainly you can overdo it on the exercise as well. So if she is in the luteal phase, still driving, then that cortisol, of course, is going to affect her progesterone. And progesterone is the, call it the star of the show in the luteal phase of the cycle, where it is going to, some of the metabolites like allopregnenolone are going to activate GABA receptors in the brain that kind of chill us out, calm us down, and allow us to have that really restful quality sleep. And technically, under the influence of progesterone, you should be getting the best sleep of your cycle in the luteal phase. So if it's worse for her, that tells me that her load management is off. So load management in terms of physical load, in terms of chemical load potentially, and in terms of emotional load, right? So how can she prioritize parasympathetic activation in the luteal phase of her cycle? And that may look like a lot of different things. It could be walking instead of going to Orange Theory. I'm not poo-pooing Orange Theory, but I've seen it enough times. Women love their Orange Theory. They love their F45. They love their, their hit, all the time. So can she go for a walk? Is she able to maybe go for a walk at sunrise or sunset, right? So getting either early morning light or second best time of the day is that sunset light. Again, helps with that circadian reset, some of the hormones and the chemical concoction that allow for a blissful sleep to happen. Other things that I find to be very helpful for sleep is core body temperature manipulation. So we were talking about sunlight, we were talking about parasympathetic load, but is the room cold? And one of the things I kind of, joke about, I posted a couple of maybe weeks ago now, like what I do with my hair overnight. And someone was like, wow, my husband would kill me. I'm like, yeah, you should. I have like mouth tape, woolly socks, and I have this like thing in my hair to curl my hair overnight. But woolly socks will, what we want is we want the heat to kind of go away. We want the core body temperature to lower. One of the ways that you can do that is by putting on woolly socks, because your feet are going to warm up, right? So you're going to almost like a snake charmer. You're going to like charm the blood away from the core, right? To warm up your feet. So that's another kind of tip, as well as like core body manipulation. And so if you don't have woolly socks, or you don't have the inclination to, do woolly socks, you might think about taking a really hot shower right before bed, or a hot bath. That's going to also increase your core body temperature in the bath, so that when you get out, right, you're going to have this kind of rebound where your core body temperature is going to drop, and you actually require that in order to have a really good, a good night's sleep. So those would be some initial tips that I would say. But as I'm thinking about her question, the more and more I think about it, it's like, what does your load management look like? Are you treating your body, moving and stress managing and changing maybe the way that you eat to support the luteal phase of the cycle versus your full? Because she seems to be doing okay in the first half of the cycle, which is designed for a bit more of go, go, go. But the second half, we really do have to honor that sort of hormonal milieu and the that kind of changing of that hormonal composition in the second half of the cycle.
What a beautiful explanation. I would add to this is, I'm going to assume Magdalena is probably at least late 30s, early 40s. And so when I'm looking at progesterone levels, we know that one of the first things that really is the hallmark to perimenopause, the 10 to 15 years preceding menopause, is this reduction in secretion of progesterone from the ovaries. And this is a time when many women start having sleep problems. They feel more anxious. They're more depressed. It can really be quite profoundly significant preceding that last week of their menstrual cycle. So getting a good serum lab, a blood lab, days 19 through 21, I think would be helpful for progesterone. I don't love the Dutch for trying to get a sense of what the progesterone levels are. It's not the best test for that. So I think that's one thing. But you also mentioned that your estrogen was a little low, your testosterone was a little low. Sometimes you can see low testosterone in association with low DHES DHEA sulfate in relationship to chronic stress. So much to Stephanie's point about this load management. And then really understanding that that lifestyle piece really does have significant improvement. And I have some women in perimenopause that do well with transdermal progesterone, even some that take oral progesterone just the week preceding their menstrual cycle, which really can help, reset those receptors. It upregulates GABA, allows for us to be more relaxed. And then the other piece is, you've mentioned some very good supplements, and it may just be that you are in a position where we just need a little bit more information. I would probably guess that it may be that week you need some progesterone, and that progesterone may be all that you need to have you feeling a whole lot better. I think there's not enough discussion about the role of the loss of progesterone from the ovaries. And then, it then becomes this adrenal, they call it adrenal pause, but it's almost like this adrenal hiccup. The adrenals are then called in as the backup quarterback. And if you've got chronic stress already, that's going to, impact the adrenal functioning in terms of optimization quite significantly. So I think that Stephanie obviously gave a phenomenal kind of explanation of things in terms of lifestyle that you can be doing to help improve sleep quality. But I would say a little bit of testing and then consideration to the potentiality of doing a little bit of progesterone the week prior to your menstrual cycle, I think may make a huge difference. So this is a question that came in from Martina. It's a question about the lack of sleep during breastfeeding. And boy, do I remember those days and those years. I know sleeping is fundamental to hormone health, but I'm still breastfeeding a lot during the night. Is there anything I can do to help stabilize my hormones? The baby is 20 months old. I still don't have my period back. Lots of nuance there.
Lots of nuance there. Yeah. So first of all, congratulations on your 20-month-old. I remember those days as well. My first child, I breastfed him. We were about 18, 19 months, and then he started weaning. And then my second child, we breastfed. It was well over 3 years. So I know exactly. And then he did not want to end. Like if he could still, he's like 10 right now. And like if he could still do it, like he might exercise that option. So I know where she is in terms of like the waking up overnight. Maybe the baby had a nightmare, or they're even just, they're just establishing their own circadian rhythm still. Like 20 months is still quite young for them to have like a regular sort of sleep wake cycle. So the first thing I'll say is I don't have a great answer here in terms of how can you sleep soundly through the night. I don't think at this point in the game, from the women that I've, my own experience, the women that I've talked to, I don't think that you're going to sleep through the night, nor should you expect that you or your baby should either. Something to consider, though, in terms of getting the amount of sleep that you need would be to consider more of like a biphasic sleep schedule, right? So, in other words, embracing the siesta, like the afternoon nap, right? So when your baby naps, the temptation is to cook, clean, get ahead of something. But what you probably should be doing, if you're not already doing it, is to lay down either with your baby, or if the baby's sleeping in a crib or something, for you to sleep down and like to go down and sleep and have a nap there. There is some, especially for new mothers, and I would classify her still as a new mother with a 20-month-old, that biphasic, like the 2 times in the day that you're sleeping. So one overnight, albeit disrupted, and then a second time can be a way for you to make up that sleep debt that you may be accruing, and it'll help you function. The only, caveat I would say is if you're sleeping too late in the afternoon, like typically after 4 p.m., if you're starting to take nap, but usually 20 months, like they need a nap around like, noon, 1, 2 o'clock, like you're probably going to go down at the right time. But I would say that if you're feeling very drowsy, let's say at 4 or 5 o'clock, try to push that to your bedtime. Like maybe you go to bed that evening at 8:30 or 9, with the baby. And then, however long, like maybe you're up at 1 or 2 breastfeeding the baby, but then that you're going to get another sleep session sometime in the early afternoon when baby goes down for his or her afternoon nap.
I think that's
What say
really,
you?
valuable information. I will disclose that I breastfed both my boys for a year, and then they weaned and bit and did all sorts of things that I was like, okay,
Oh,
we're
they cut their
already.
teeth on my nipples. Yes, they
Oh,
did.
yes. Oh, yes. Trying to explain to my husband that that was like pain I had never experienced before. And he kind of looked at me
Yeah.
like he couldn't understand.
Yeah.
So both my kids, my youngest, and I acknowledge every baby's different. This is not applicable to every child. I had one that started sleeping through the nights at 4 months, another at 6 months. So this wasn't something that I had experienced, but I do know and I do agree with you that sleep when baby sleeps. So if your baby is still waking up at night, whether it's for self-soothing behavior or, just habit, finding a way for you to get a little bit of rest during the day. And my mother used to say, sleep when baby sleeps. And of course, the to-do list starts to run in our minds. And next thing we know, they've woken up from a nap and then we're really chronically tired. The other thing is, it's not at all unusual while breastfeeding for women not to get their menstrual cycle. I think I went 2 solid years without a period. I remember thinking
Oh,
that was
same. Yeah.
pretty awesome not to have to worry about that. But, certainly something that I wouldn't be overtly concerned if you're still breastfeeding. If you're a thinner female, I think a lot of the thinner females may go a longer period of time without having a menstrual cycle, but just understanding that doesn't in and of itself, I know this wasn't the question, that doesn't in and of itself mean that you can't get pregnant. Like it just don't assume because you're not getting your period that that may not play a role. But I would say give yourself some grace, try to rest when your baby rests. It may be that it's become a habit that he or she is waking up. And so just trying to determine, is it because they're, do they need an extra feeding before they go to bed? What's going on? Are they self-soothing? They're just fussy in the middle of the night and that helps them kind of get settled again. But it's such a beautiful time in our lives to be able to bond with our children. I don't ever want to discourage that or let that be the message. If your baby's still interested in breastfeeding, I would just continue until you both decide that it's the time for you both to end that part of your relationship.
Yeah, I mean, not that I miss it anymore. Like my children are 13 and 11 now, but it was such a I wouldn't be
It
doing it now,
was.
but I would say it's such a special,
Mhm.
precious time. And for women who are new, like that is the work, right? That is our job at that point is mothering, like being fully attentive, like our neurology, our physiology is all directed towards the baby. So you can lean into that and just enjoy it. I know she's probably heard this before, but the days are long, but the years are really short. And you will blink and your children will be 13 and 11 as mine are now. And you're like, and your iPhone sometimes will throw up like, remember when? And, like 10 years ago. And you're like, how was that 10 years ago?
I
So,
know.
yeah, I would just say lean into it. Don't worry so much about optimizing your sleep. Like, yes, it's important. Yes, it's a recovery tool. Yes, it's helpful for balancing your hormones. And there will be a time when your baby can sleep through the night. And there's also, there's growth spurts and regression, right? Like there's times, like you were saying, your baby slept through at 4 months and then 6 months. My babies would do that for, let's say, a couple weeks, and I'd be like, great, new routine, got it. And then there would be some
Yeah.
developmental change that they would be approaching, and things would get all messed up again. So just have the flexibility of thinking to know that you are just going to be constantly in flux right now until you and the baby decide that you're not going to be breastfeeding anymore, and that the baby establishes like a pretty solid circadian sort of schedule in terms of like sleep wake cycles. And it's okay for you not to be doing perfect sleep. I wrote about this actually in my book, like more, I was at the time when I was writing the book, there was a lot of sort of prominent podcasters and online, they were all men, and they were like, this is the perfect morning routine. And I was like, hi, you know what the morning routine is for me? My child waking me up. That's my morning routine. Like it was my toddler kind of toddling into my bed and being like, mommy, or coming in for a feeding or whatever it was. So don't worry about the perfect sleep schedule. Don't worry, like don't have any anxiety around that. Just do what you can right now, because that is your primary role right now as a new mom.
Yeah. And there's a season and a reason. Like I'm at the
Yeah.
stage where I have one getting ready to leave the nest at the end of the spring of next year. He's going to head off to college. And
Oh
so
my
I can assure
gosh.
you that what we deal with now at this stage is these kids will sleep all day if you let them on the weekend because they stay up. They're like they're like night owls. Now they stay up really late. They don't get enough sleep during the week. Then on the weekend, they try to catch up. And so with each season as a parent, we just try to, it's like we're trying to kind of fluctuate around like their needs and where they are developmentally and growth and everything else. So such a great question. The next one is about preconception. What are recommended tests to obtain for optimizing fertility?
The best tests for optimizing fertility?
Mm-hmm.
Well, first I would say track your cycle. So I am a big fan in terms of understand, like, you are an advocate of this as well, in terms of understanding your own unique rhythm. So the first thing is tracking your cycle. It can be on an app, it can be on an Excel spreadsheet, Google Sheet, whatever. I would also be tracking. I'm a big fan of, I know there's a question around contraception. And so this is kind of related to that. I'm a big fan of like fertility awareness method, or FAM. And part of that, in terms of that's going to serve you for as a contraceptive if you don't want to get pregnant. And if you do want to get pregnant, understanding your cervical mucus, which is, it's not just sort of like gunk in your underwear. It's actually it's giving you clues and signs in terms of where your estrogen levels are at. Are you fertile right now? And we'll talk about what that might look like in a moment. But for like FAM, or fertility awareness method, you're tracking a couple of things. One is the cervical mucus, as I mentioned, your basal body temperature. So your temperature will change over the course of your cycle, and that can indicate ovulation. You'll often see ovulation, you'll see a bit of a spike in your basal body temperature. So for it might be like 0.5 to even like 1 degree Fahrenheit. If you're working in Celsius, it might be 0.2 to 0.5 degrees Celsius. Like you may see, if you're wearing an Oura ring, as I am right now, if you're watching this on video, you're going to get knocked on your readiness score because you're going to be warmer. It's gonna be like, oh, you were warm last night. And it's like, yeah, I'm ovulating, and then the other thing, this might require a little bit more internal exam, or self-internal exam, is like the cervical position, right? So when we are ovulating or ready to receive, let's say, sperm, the opening of the cervix will be softer versus when we are infertile or not ready to receive the sperm. Your cervix, the tip of the cervix, let's say, or what you can sort of feel internally, is going to feel quite hard. It might even almost feel like the tip of, like almost like the tip of your nose. It might feel like a little bit like there's a resistance there, but when you're ovulating, that softens up and it allows for the passage a bit more open and a bit more effaced. So you're allowing for sperm to sort of pass through. So that's sort of FAM in a nutshell. That would be what I would do first. Was really understand your own cervical mucus pattern, your own basal body temperature pattern. I'll be doing internal examinations to kind of get to know your cervix, because none of us do. I remember once I had put a post up about cervical mucus, and people were, it was like, it was shocking to people. It's like, well, this is what we do. Like, this is, when we see estrogen rising. So I'll sort of answer this question comprehensively. As we see estrogen rising in the follicular phase, so after bleed week stops, we're going to start to see a rise in estrogen. That's going to coincide with more wetness, right? So you're going to see in your underwear, you might see more slipperiness, more almost clear discharge. And then as you're getting closer to ovulation, that discharge is going to start to look more opaque, a bit more white. Some people will call it like lotion, or even like egg whitey, like an egg white almost consistency. If you were to put it in between your fingers, as I have, you might find that you can sort of stretch it. It has a little bit of like malleability to it. The last day where you see that kind of gooey stretchiness, that opaque presentation, is when you are ovulating. So the next day you're going to start to see a marked change in the mucus, where it's not going to be as egg whitey. It's not going to be as slippery anymore. It's almost, you're going to sort of move into like almost like a bit of a dry, because estrogen falls off after we ovulate. Estrogen comes down, so you're going to see the same corresponding lack of wetness, let's say, in your underwear. So that would be the best way for you to be thinking about fertility, at least for the first year of trying. If you are trying for a year, even over 6 months, then I would start looking at, I would actually get him tested and you tested. So if it's, oftentimes when we look at fertility, we typically tend to blame the woman first. We tend to be like, oh, there must be something wrong with her, so let's just check all of her stuff. So you can totally get your hormones checked. You can look at AMH, you can look at FSH, you can look at all your sex hormones. And I would also get his sperm checked as well. So we are looking at count, like how much, let's say parts per million, or how much sperm we have in one ejaculate. And then you also want to be looking for the quality of the sperm as well. So, a glutination, like there's different sort of presentations of sperm. Like you have like the healthy sperm that we think about with the single head and the single tail. And then you see variations. Sometimes you see a double-headed sperm. Sometimes you see sperm without a flagellum. Like you see all of these different kind of mutations, we'll say. So we want to look at sperm count, which is a really big problem. Dr. Shauna Swan, I had her on the show. She was talking about sperm decline over the last, I think it was 50 years. I think the last they were looking at from the 1960s, or maybe later, maybe the 1970s to like the last time they looked was like maybe 2010, and it had decreased by more than 50%. So if there's a problem with fertility, it can be coming from the man, or it can be coming from the woman, or both, right? So we just want to look at both. Oftentimes, there is a tendency to look at the female first, but it's very easy to evaluate male sperm count as well. So I would just put that into the mix initially too.
Love that explanation. So thorough. And, when we're thinking about infradian rhythms, our internal rhythms that we have over a 28, 30-day cycle, it's so helpful to be aware of what's going on in our bodies. Like I was just talking to a client who's in her 50s, and she said, no one ever told me what to expect at any stage of
I
my life.
know.
We were just kind of handed off oral contraceptives, sent on our merry, happy way. And then years later, you're realizing, oh, I've been so disconnected from the normal physiologic rhythms of the body. And so, I think that cycle tracking, checking your basal body temperature, looking at cervical mucus, and even if you don't feel 100% comfortable looking at your cervical mucus, just acknowledging there's changes throughout your cycle is so helpful and beneficial. The other thing that I would say is, for me personally, I don't know how much I've talked about this on the podcast, but this is how I knew I wasn't ovulating. When I was in my early 30s, when my husband and I got married, I had no idea that I was thin phenotype PCOS. No idea. And it was only because I brought in all these charts. Back then, you didn't put them in an app that was preceding the app stage of life, but showing them to my GYN. And the first thing she said is, you have a luteal phase defect. You don't have enough progesterone. I need to refer you on to someone. And that was, kind of started our infertility journey. But the acknowledgement of, if I had not done that basic assessment for a couple months, we would not have been able to objectively look at the information and say, well, I'm not even ovulating. No wonder why I'm not getting pregnant. So you don't necessarily have to use all the high level tech to start with. Like this kind of observational data can be very helpful. And as Stephanie indicated, the lab work can complement and also help identify if there are any issues. What we find now is that men in particular, either from insulin resistance or endocrine mimicking chemical exposure, and we have so much of it, that can plummet sperm counts for men. So you could look healthy on the outside and not either have a healthy, vibrant sperm count, or your motility may be poor, or you may have, as you mentioned, the double-headed sperm with a lack of flagella. You might have a lot of defects in the sperm themselves. So knowledge is power. Most people don't have any issues getting pregnant. That's not the why I'm sharing this. I'm just sharing that from someone who otherwise was pretty healthy. Being on oral contraceptives for so many years had disconnected me from those internal rhythms of my body. And it took a bit of time for things to start working and being optimized. So such a great question. I would say knowledge is power. Do the low tech stuff first, get the testing done, talk to your clinician, make sure that they're on board with what you want to have happen. But more often than not, I find most women don't have any trouble getting pregnant, thankfully.
Yeah. And then just enjoy, the other thing I'll just say is like, just enjoy the process of trying to get
Yes.
pregnant. Like, it's such a
Yes.
wonderful, like, at least for me, I was raised Catholic. So it was like, you cannot get pregnant. Like, that is the
Yes.
goal of your, existence as a woman. You cannot get pregnant. So it was almost like backwards land when me and my husband at the time, we were like, all right, we're going to try for a baby. And it was so, um, I mean, it's always like, oh my gosh, like, I'm a good girl. Like, I don't get pregnant. But then it's like, no, this is what I want to do. I want to get pregnant. So just like lean into that, have fun with your
Yes.
partner. Don't worry too much about if you don't get pregnant one time. Like, I remember, for at least for me, I'll just share my own experience. It's like when I wanted babies, it was like a switch. It was like I went from not wanting them, and then all of a sudden I was noticing all of the babies in the carriages and the strollers, and I would see the babies at the park, and I was the weird person in the park, like watching the babies play. And I was like, okay, I need one of these right now. And I was, after, we had been together, I was like doing handstands, and I was doing all the things, not scientifically validated technique, just for, just for the record. But I was like, I have to get pregnant right now. And it was very easy for me to get pregnant. So I can understand and because I was like, I need a child and I need a child right now. Like, it was just something switched in my biological clock. Like, I need the child and I need to get pregnant right now. So I can understand the angst, if someone's trying to get pregnant and they're not, and they have that same feeling maybe that I experienced, like, I want a child, like, I want it, why is it not happening? I would just encourage you as much as you can to try and enjoy the process, because two stressed out individuals that are like looking at their clock and they're like, okay, we got 12 hours, honey. Let's, like, it can work. And, I would just say as much as you can, it's not necessarily about the destination as much as it is about the journey together that you're taking with your partner. So I would just throw that in. It's not related to it's sort of related to the question. She didn't ask it, but I'm just
Yeah.
throwing in my own 2 cents there.
No. And I think for anyone that's listening that maybe your fertility journey was longer than others, just knowing that, even though we did use some reproductive technology, it was fairly low tech. And I was so grateful when we got pregnant with my oldest and then we got pregnant with my youngest. And I remember saying, had it been an easier process, we might have had more children, but we just felt so grateful and blessed that we had two healthy
Yeah,
kids that we just said, okay, we're going to
we're
take a break
good.
and reassess things.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
The next question's about what is the best contraceptive for younger women. We already kind of addressed some of her other questions. What do you feel like is your favorite contraceptive for younger women? These are individuals that really do need the benefit of having free choice over when they choose to become pregnant. And there's so many options that are out there. Obviously, I think you and I are very aligned in terms of where our preferences are,
Yeah.
but ultimately finding the best option that works for you and your lifestyle.
Yeah. So I think, like many things, I think you have to experiment with a couple of different verticals and see what works for you. If you were asking me the question, I would say start with the fertility awareness method again, because again, I'll come back to my Catholic upbringing. I used to think that you could get pregnant by going into a pool. Like, I used to think you could get pregnant anytime, anywhere. And actually, the science does not support that theory. And I don't even know where I got that from. But and this is not just I'm just not knocking on the Catholic Church. I know that there's many sort of religions that sort of talk about this idea of like waiting until you're married and all of that. But um, you are infertile most of the month. This is something that I think I mean, certainly there's outliers. Of course, you can get pregnant, potentially there's been women who've gotten pregnant on, during their period or even in their luteal phase or what have you. But for the majority of women, for most of their lives, most of your cycle, it is impossible to get pregnant. There's about a 5 to 7 day window in your cycle where you can become pregnant. And that is, of course, around ovulation. So when you release the egg, depending on your age, will be alive for somewhere. If you're older, the egg is going to be less viable for a shorter amount of time. Like, it can be 18 hours, 24 hours. If you're younger, the egg will last maybe up to 48 hours. So there's a day or two, let's say 24 to 48 hours where the egg is viable. And if you've had penetrative sex where there's ejaculate in the days leading up to that ovulation, of course, the sperm, and this is again how much I have reverence for reproduction and the propagation of the species, is that the sperm can actually live for up to 5 to 7 days, kind of in and around ovulation. So if you've had sex in, let's say, the 5 days or to even the week prior to you ovulating, you can technically still get pregnant because there can be sperm in and around the area that are waiting to penetrate the egg. So I always technically it's like a 2 day, you're sort of at the maximum, like 2 days where you're fertile. But if you've had penetrative sex in about the week or so leading up to ovulation, you can become pregnant because that sperm will continue to live for that week. So other than that, though, there's 3 weeks outside of that window where you are infertile. So I would always, at least for me, I would start with FAM. I would start with the fertility awareness method, knowing my cycle, knowing my rhythm, knowing my mucus, my basal body temperature. And then if I'm wanting not to get pregnant, I would be avoiding penetrative sex in week 2. It's around week 2 of the cycle. So at the cessation of bleed week up until ovulation, I would sort of stay away from penetration. And there's lots of other fun things that you can do with your partner other than penetrative sex in that time. And then you can rest assured that after you've ovulated, about 2 days or so, depending on your age, after you've ovulated, you're pretty much not able to get pregnant. However, there are many other, I know you've talked about the birth control pill, the many different types of contraceptives. So there's oral contraceptives, there's hormonal, there's mechanical, right? We have the Mirena, we have the copper IUD. There's many other ways that you can go about it. I think that my only caveat there is that you really do understand some of the potential side effects. And what we see over and over again, I know you've talked about this, I see this all the time in my community, is that women are not communicated. There's not informed consent. It's like, hey, just take this low dose estrogen. Let's just take this low dose, very safe birth control pill. And nobody talks about the length of time that you might be on it. You talked about your experience about the length of time that you were on the birth control pill, potentially affecting that brain ovarian axis, where that communication that's established between the brain and your reproductive system is essentially cut off. So I would say you can certainly explore hormonal contraceptives. And I would probably link out to some of the guests and the topics that you've had on previous podcasts where you've talked about some of the side effects that you're not going to get that conversation likely in your doctor's office unless they are someone who practices functional medicine or is aware of this or the side effects themselves and are willing to take the time to communicate them to you. So that would be that. And then the only other thing I'll say is copper IUD. At least I've never used IUD, but for the women that I've counseled and just in my community, it's like hit or miss. Like it's either the best thing since sliced bread, it's the best, or it's awful. People get headaches and they're nauseous. And so it's sort of this, you kind of have to try it to see if it's going to work for you and have a good working relationship with your PCP to be able to communicate to them. These are the symptoms that I'm having. This is what's new. This is what's coming up. Can we modify the dose or the mechanism for the contraceptive?
I think you bring up so many good points. And a great deal of this is women oftentimes get gaslit when they're trying to figure out and navigate contraception. So there is no judgment. If you choose to take oral contraceptives, I did a great podcast with Dr. Felice Gersh, where she talks about some of the,
she's great.
oh, she's so lovely. Some of the side effects and concerns around that. But for some people, they need to take it and forget it and be done with it and then move on. If you're not, if you want to have a set it and forget it kind of mechanism, I think an IUD is certainly a nice option. And I would probably lean into the copper. And I would agree with you, for as many women as have found that a copper IUD has been super helpful and low symptoms, I've had just as many that have had weight gain, headaches, bloating, cramping, pain with insertion.
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
Anna Quebeca was talking about on our most recent podcast together. She said, there's no reason why women can't get, lidocaine prior to the insertion of an IUD. Like no one should have pain, because she said she actually had quite a bit of pain with her IUD insertion years ago. And then if you're interested in looking at apps and cervical mucus and checking your basal body temperature, I mean, it runs the gamut. And so there's no right or wrong. It's what is going to be most effective for you at the stage of life that you're in. And I find that a lot of younger women want to have a set it and forget it kind of methodology. Like they're like, I don't want to worry about the chance of pregnancy. Maybe in a couple years, I might think more thoughtfully, and I'm using their words, not mine, it's not pejorative, think more thoughtfully about what other options are available to me. But the options surrounding contraception, more often than not, there's not enough informed consent. So people don't fully understand all the ramifications. And I'll just plug this in here. If you are a perimenopause or menopausal female, this is not HRT. I cannot tell you how many women will say, my doctor finally put me on HRT, and they'll tell me what they're on. And I'm like, that's actually an oral contraceptive.
Yeah.
And they're stunned. So acknowledging things have their place, but finding what works best for you and making sure that you've been fully informed about all the side effects, all the implications. And if you're on long-term oral contraceptives like I was, because back 20, 30 years ago, that's just what they did, help people understand that when you go off, you may not automatically get your period back.
Yeah.
That was certainly my experience. And I know Jolene Brighton talks quite a bit about this, about that disconnection between the hypothalamus ovarian axis when you go off of oral contraceptives. It does not per se just come back online. It's almost like you reboot your computer and you expect the computer to start working automatically. That may not be the case.
Well said.
Okay, moving on. We are going to talk about a topic that I know both of us love discussing, detoxification. And this is a question from Anna. What are some of the ways to detox the body besides exercise and sauna?
This is a good question. I saw this come in. I think so. Obviously, when we're thinking about exercise and sauna, the primary way that they're helping to amplify detoxification is sweating, right? So getting rid of toxins via, like there's many emunctory glands, the sweat, the skin is one of them. And just generally detoxification, just for our listeners, obviously this is like where we take toxins and we eliminate them, right? So we can upregulate our detoxification pathways by, there's a couple of different ways. So consuming more green leafy vegetables. So you can do like a nutritional, you can amplify, like detoxification primarily happens in the liver. There are other areas, but the liver is one of the major sources or major centers for detoxification. And green leafy vegetables, and I know you're smiling because you're like, yep, this is what I talk about all the time. I know, and I know that you do. So, diindole methane and sulforaphanes, these are compounds that are found in those green leafy vegetables, are going to help to amplify different steps of the detoxification process. So green leafy vegetables. So what are those? Those are like the kales, those are the broccolis, those are anything that smells like, if you leave broccoli or Brussels sprouts like in the fridge and it starts smelling like kind of sulfur, like the it almost sort of smells like eggs, like, that's the sulforaphane, right? So broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, arugula, I said kale, like, anything that's sort of green and leafy, usually is going to have a high concentration of those two compounds, the DIM, the diindole methane, and the sulforaphane. You can also supplement. I personally, it's one of the sponsors of our show, like Athletic Greens is something that I take every day because I don't, in the vein of transparency and honesty, I don't often get as much greens as I would like. So I sort of take AG1 in the morning. And then of course I make a really awesome Brussels sprout, like grilled or sauteed Brussels sprouts on the in the saute pan, and I'll do cheese and broccoli soup, and like I get greens, but just as sort of an insurance policy, I'll take a green supplement. You can also supplement with DIM, there's DIM supplementation that you can do. And I think that this woman's question was also, she said that she had fibrocystic breasts. Was that right? I think she was saying too,
She's
like she had, or what did she say that she had? Let me find
Yeah, so the
uh,
second half of her question was dense breast tissue. She said,
oh
I
yeah,
did the depot shot for 7 years and was told that contributed to it. I was advised to do a mammogram with ultrasound every 6 months. Holy cow,
yeah.
which I
Holy
will not
cow.
do the
Yeah.
mammogram that frequently.
Yeah, agree on that. So okay, so I'll say that I also, so fibrocystic or the dense breast that she's talking about is also usually a sign of estrogen dominance. So I had that for many, many years where my breasts were kind of always a bit lumpy. And part of that is like poor detoxification. So green leafy vegetables every day really helps with that. Obviously, drinking more water is going to help you flush out toxins. And then bowel movements, right? Like having a bowel movement on the daily. I would say that when you're looking for, again, quality of the stool movement of the stool is important. So if the stool was hard to pass, right? So if you were straining on the toilet, it had a long transit time, like it actually took a long time, like you were on the toilet for 5, 10 minutes, trying to pass the bowel movement, that's likely problematic. And then also looking at the stool itself. So, like one sort of long piece is ideal. If it's broken up into sort of smaller, harder, round balls, let's say, that might be a sign of dehydration, might be a sign of lack of fiber in the diet as well. So including like the green leafy vegetables, one of the nice things is you sort of get a double bang. So you get all those compounds we were talking about, and you get a lot of fiber. So fiber, as you're consuming it, as you know, it attracts water to the stool that's forming in the intestinal as it's passing through the intestines, softens the stool as well. So if you have sort of these round, I call them like little rabbit poos, if you've ever had like a rabbit in your backyard and you go in, you're like, oh my God, there's these little round little presents that they've left us. If you're seeing that, let's say in the toilet bowl, it's either lack of fiber, lack of water, usually both. So increasing fiber intake, increasing water intake is also really going to help. And those will help the dense breast tissue. Because you're going to be helping with estrogen detoxification. Like estrogen is again processed by the liver. This like the process of detoxification, we are also metabolizing our estrogens that way. And so if you are someone like me who tends to, left to her own devices, will produce some of the metabolite, like some of the sort of downstream metabolites of estrogen, I tend to produce sort of the quinone damaging, like DNA damaging, like I tend to go down the pathway. It's called 4-OH, or 4-hydroxy estradiol or estrone. If you are taking green leafy or the dim, specifically the dim actually helps you sort of jump pathways to more of the protective pathway, that 2-OH pathway that will help with the dense breasts. So I've sort of taken my breasts from sort of being lumpy masses to like relatively soft. I will do a breast check usually the first day or two that I get my period. And it used to, I would kind of checking and it was just like just a lumpy mess. And not to be too much TMI here, but whatever. And now they're just soft. There's not a lot of there's no there's none of those, that lumpy bumpiness that used to be there. In terms of the mammo every 6 months, God damn it, that's a lot. I feel like I hate that frequency. I actually I'm not a big fan of, I'm going to get so much blowback for this, but I don't like mammos generally. I feel like, especially I'm a small breasted woman, right? I am like the president of the itty bitty titty committee, right? So like to take my breasts and to flatten it's everything is getting pulled off of my body, and I'm sure it's the same for our beautiful, well endowed sisters as well. But I just think about what the hell is happening to the tissue as it's being pancaked like that. Like you're bursting cells, you are completely deranging the material. Like the cysts are being like everything is sort of being compressed mechanically. So I wonder, what the long-term effects of that is. And then, when you sort of couple that with some of the literature that I've looked at in terms of mammograms being a pretty poor predictor of changes in the breast tissue. Like they can usually see something once it's been sitting in the tissue, it's something like 8 to 10 years. So if you've had some small mass or some, change um, in tissue quality in the breast, a mammogram is going to pick that up relatively late. Um, so that being, I don't like mammograms, and I'm sure someone's going to come after me for saying that, but it's just the truth. I don't like them.
Yeah, it's interesting. I had Dr. Jen Simmons, who's a breast cancer surgeon,
Hmm.
coming on and talking about she doesn't like mammograms. She thinks that they tend to overdiagnose.
Yeah,
Uh,
there's a lot of false positives.
a
That's
lot of
right.
false positives, a lot of women that go
Mhm.
through a lot of stress and duress. And she's
Yeah.
actually an advocate of some new technology. It's ultrasonic technology that is as
Hmm.
diagnostic as an MRI without the radiation. And so she's looking to bring that technology across the United States. Right now, she's based out of Philadelphia, but they are working on, because as you can imagine, radiology centers don't want their cash cow
And
to be
it's
impacted, and
profitable.
so they,
Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
they are making
Hmm.
sure that it's hard to bring this technology to market in a diffuse manner. I know myself, I get mammograms like every 3 years. I kind of go along with the European guidelines that are
Hmm.
less frequent, but I agree with you that we have a tendency to overexpose patients to radiology, radiation rather, and that in and of itself can create a lot of problems. But I love how you kind of synopsized all those wonderful things. And for anyone that's listening, if you're not familiar with the Dutch hormone test, it looks at dried urine and
Oh.
saliva. You can get a
Mhm.
really nice picture of how your estrogen metabolism is. And so for me, looking at those different pathways that we can break down estrogen, that can be very insightful about, do you need to do a little extra to help phase 1 or phase 2 liver detoxification? Obviously, this podcast is, we're doing AMA questions, so I'm trying to keep things really brief, but some people need DIM to help with pushing the estrogen down that beneficial 2OH pathway. Some people need phase 2 support, and they might need things like calcium D-glucarate. I'm one of them because I methylate
Mhm.
really poorly, and that's a genetic thing that I have that I was born with. I always say my parents gave me a lot of good things. That's one of those things that requires a
Genes
little
were
bit.
not one of them.
Yes, exactly. I was like, those are one of those things I have to work extra on. But
I'm the same. I have very poor methylation pathways as well.
oh,
Yeah.
see,
Hmm.
we have so many similarities.
So I can't even, if I go to my naturopath, there's a naturopath around the corner. She does IV therapy. And once she gave me methylated, what was it? I think it's like methylated B vitamins. And I just had the wickedest headache. And I said to her afterwards, I'm like, I don't think I can ever do that again. And it was like methylated with some glutathione, and everything was methylated. And I just had the worst headache because my relay system, like the process of moving the methyl group along the pathway, is so slow that there was just this big backlog with the IV therapy, all the methylation, all the
Yeah.
methylated B, the methylated this, the methylated that. My body didn't, it was just too much for it. So everything was sort of backing up. I had the worst headache. So
Oh,
yeah.
never a fun thing to go through. Okay, we're going to pivot because we have a lot of weight training questions, and I just want to
Yeah.
quickly get through some of these perimenopause, ugh, get some through some of these perimenopause questions.
Yeah.
In perimenopause, I have Hashimoto's and fibromyalgia. I find if I push too hard in the weight room, the next day I feel like crap. How hard should we push it to still gain muscle but not overdo it? Such a good question. This is from Leandra.
Well, Leandra, this is a fantastic question and a very common one as well. So the guiding principle, so she has an autoimmune condition, right? So she has Hashimoto's thyroiditis and fibromyalgia, which is not, when we think about hashies, this is sort of a classic AI autoimmune condition, but they're starting to look at things like fibromyalgia, depression, as sort of subclasses of autoimmunity as well. So she's kind of got two going on there. The overriding principle for anybody with hashies, like the class, the multiple sclerosis, the lupus, the Sjorgen's, all of that, you want to stimulate, not annihilate. Okay. And this is the hardest for our autoimmune ladies because, and we'll just we'll just jump to the trauma conversation right away. A lot of the residue that the reason why our body in some case, not all cases, but in many cases, at least my clinical experience with working with a lot of these women, is that their immune system has become dysregulated and is sort of turned against them. Essentially, that's what's happening in an autoimmune process. But part of the reason for that is unresolved trauma. So that can be any type, big T trauma, it can be sexual abuse, physical abuse, all of the things that you might find on an adverse childhood experiences, like an ACE questionnaire. But it can also be smaller T trauma, right? The death of a dog, or moving a lot, or being bullied in school, like things like that, that sort of still live in the nervous system. And so when we pair the nervous system, we have this psycho, neuro, immune, endocrine kind of conglomerate that all works together. When you are stuck in this sort of fight or flight from things from your past, you tend to, at least, and I can say, I know my ACE score is a 5, which is very high, which also puts me at a higher risk for things like autoimmunity. So I'm always looking at my thyroglobulin antibody. I'm always looking at some of those things on my blood work. So I know that I have a higher propensity for that. But a lot of women who have experienced trauma in their earlier years, typically they become hyper independent, right? Very self-sufficient. Like, I'm an island. I'm going to do everything myself. Nobody's going to help me because anytime I ask for help, I'm disappointed. Like, at least that was my story for a long time. And so when you get to the gym, it can be very difficult to know what gentle is. And so I'm giving you kind of some of my backstory here as demonstratively to tell you that it might be harder for you to know when you've reached your limit, because that internal GPS system about when you're about to burn out or when you've done too much might be gone awry because you are so fiercely independent. So I just want to say we want to stimulate, not annihilate. So what does that mean in practice? Typically for my Hashis patients or anyone who's dealing with any type of autoimmune condition, I want you to be thinking about in the gym, just to give you something tangible. And like when we think of RPEs, or rate of perceived exertion, it should be something like a 5 or a 6 for you, because that is going to be enough of a stimulus to get the muscles working, releasing the myokines, driving hypertrophy, but it's gentle enough that you're not annihilating the immune system, because your immune system is sensitive, right? It's exquisitely sensitive to external and internal stimuli. So we want to be thinking about 5 or 6 out of 10 as a general kind of guideline. So that's good. That might be different for everybody, but when you're doing even one set, if you say, okay, I'm going to try to go for 10 reps, let's say, at the end of the 10 reps, it should be like, okay, that was about a 5 out of 10, 6 out of 10 maximum. And that's going to help with you not feeling bagged for several days. The other thing I will say for my autoimmune men and women, but primarily women, it affects women much more than it does men, is your recovery practices are also of the extreme utmost importance. So dialing in sleep, assuming you don't have a 20-month-old baby, like our earlier question, being very strict about sleep, cold plunges, cold showers, saunas or hot showers, making sure you're taking enough time off in between gym sessions. So if let's say you do something on Monday, maybe the next time you go back is like Wednesday, you're not going every single day and you're not annihilating one body part. I would probably say for an autoimmune protocol, like you probably want to do full body every time. Like you don't want to break up your workouts into like just legs, so you're just annihilating the legs and then you can't walk. Like it would be just like a flush throughout the entire body. And that would apply for everyone who's dealing with any so this could be this, I know this woman has FM and Hashis, but anyone who's dealing with an autoimmune condition, like 5 to 6 out of 10 should be the intensity. And then like becoming a master at recovery.
I think those are also important. And I would tag in there that if you are stable on your autoimmune protocol, like let's say you're being treated for Hashimoto's, your antibodies are coming down, you feel good, you're sleeping well, that's when you go to the gym and you push yourself to that perceived exertion that Stephanie was referring to. And afterwards, you don't feel like you need to take a nap. Like that is the check-in point with yourself. If your thyroid antibodies have suddenly gone through the roof, you're really tired, you don't feel good. We talk about this role of hormesis, this beneficial stress in the right amount at the right time. That's a time that you'd be better off going to take a walk. So, as someone who does actually have Hashimoto's, which thankfully is in remission, my tell is I know I've worked out too hard when I need to take a nap afterwards. You try to go to the point where you're pushing yourself, but not so hard. And it doesn't mean I'm not pushing myself. It just means for me, because of my autoimmune history, because of my ACE scores, because of my trauma history, I know like where that fine line is. And I can tell when I overdo it. Usually my tell is I'm really tired. It's like, okay, I overdid it. Now I have to do 5 extra things to help quiet my autonomic nervous system, to reassure my body. Okay, next time, maybe I don't need to do box jumps that are, like the 3-foot tall box jumps. Maybe I need to do the 1 foot. Like, I have a tendency to be very competitive, and I'm sharing this with listeners so that they understand like we're all humans, but helping people understand there's that fine line. And I think for a lot of women, and this is something you and I were talking about in our DMs one day, there's that fine line between pushing yourself and then overdoing it, and trying to find where that is for yourself, I think is very, very important.
And you're going to play, and there's going to be some times where you're totally going to overdo it. And there's going to be times when you get it just right. And again, that flexibility of thinking around, okay, I have to figure out what's right for me every time I'm in the gym, I think that's one of the things I love about weight training in some respect, is that it forces you to learn about yourself, because we can all talk about squats, right? But we're all going to squat slightly differently. Our femur lengths are slightly differently. We have a pelvic tilt that's going to be different, a lumbar lordosis that's going to be slightly. So there's all these different uh different, well, I guess differences between us, these individual nuances that make our approach to the exercise different. And so it's okay to play, and it's okay to miss the target sometimes. Like sometimes you're going to overdo it, and you're just going to forgive yourself, and you're going to say, okay, what can I learn? And the next time that you go to the gym, you're going to say, okay, those box jumps really did me in last time. I'm not going to do them, or I'm going to do the one, the lower level. Instead of the 30 inches, I'm going to do the, whatever it is, the 12-inch jumps or whatever. So I think that's a point well taken. It's something that it actually took me a long time to learn, even without an autoimmune condition, because I tend to be a very driven, very competitive, as you said, tend to be self-sufficient as well. Like, I'm like, oh, I'll do it myself. Like no one's going to do it as well as I am. And so for years I would have, I would call it my internal GPS, like these internal antennas they just didn't work. Like I just couldn't tell when I was tired. I couldn't tell when I was pushing myself too hard. And then I would just collapse, and I would just be on the couch for a day or two. And I'm like, how did I get here? Why didn't I see the signs? And of course, hindsight's always 2020. You're like, oh yeah, when I was, getting those headaches and I was still punching out my work when I should have been stepping away from the computer, maybe that was a sign. So all that to say is that individuals with autoimmunity.
I started weight training thanks to you both, but hunger in my luteal phase is now insane.
So eat, girl.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's actually really exciting. Whenever you are starting to get hungrier, it's usually a sign that your metabolism is kicking up into a higher gear. So don't, again, just kind of what we were saying with our autoimmune girl, don't ignore those signs. Like listen to your body, feed your body. You're typically hungrier in the luteal phase anyway, because it is a metabolically active time. We're growing the endometrial lining, prepping it for shedding, if you're not going to be pregnant, you're not going to become pregnant. So I would say increase your calories. General rule of thumb is like up it by about 10%. So if you're someone who's having, I don't know, 1,800 calories, let's say, like maybe you're going to up it by 180 to 200 calories. And that should be sufficient, making sure that it's higher protein so that you're satiating that hunger, because protein is very satiating. I like to, I tend to like to pair protein with fat because I find those two together are very, at least for my palate and my body, very satiating. I really like the eggs and the avocado, that kind of combination. So I would definitely be increasing protein. And celebrate that your metabolism is increasing. That's awesome. That's what happens when you have more muscle, by the way, is your muscles are metabolically active, and it will by necessity drive up your you will become hungrier. I remember when I can't remember what I had started doing, like a new leg routine. And I don't remember if it was just a volume increase or maybe it was a weight increase, but I was starving I couldn't get enough food in. Like the next day, I could not eat enough. And it was just like, I just followed those cues because my legs were healing, right? My legs were needing that substrate in order to grow, to adapt to the stimulus that I had just, given them the day before. So I would just say, listen to your body, celebrate that you're hungrier. It means that your metabolism is increasing, and don't ignore those signs, and have some more protein.
Yeah, all such good points. I would say the one thing to add in there, and I don't know if this young woman is fasting, but I typically will say, as you're getting towards when menstruation will start, those 5 to 7 days preceding menstruation, which is part of the luteal phase, that's the time to back off on fasting. So if you are lifting heavy and fasting and starving, to Stephanie's point, eat. Number two, sometimes you need a little bit more discretionary carbohydrate, not a lot. It might be that you need half a cup of sweet potato, or maybe you need some low glycemic berries, but don't be afraid to adjust your macros accordingly. I always found that for me, I needed a little bit more carbohydrate because at that point, when I was still in my early 40s and lifting what I thought to be heavy at that time, now I know better. But I would sometimes find that week I would be really hungry, and I would remind myself that, okay, my body is giving me these cues. It needs a little bit more of certain macronutrients. So protein without question, maybe a little bit more carbohydrate, and definitely avoid fasting. Like 12 hours of digestive rest is certainly fine, but that's not the time to be doing long fasts, 16, 18, 20 hours. That's usually the time that I will encourage women to take a little bit of a break and have a little bit more rest in between their feeding schedules.
Beautifully said. Yeah, beautifully said. Yeah, the carbs is that point is actually well taken. In the luteal phase, I would completely agree with that. We need more carbs. Like and it's not something to be afraid of. Yeah, good
No,
point.
unfortunately, they've been demonized. Okay, favorite pre-workout. This is from Anonymous.
Favorite pre-workout. I'm gonna say coffee. I love coffee. I have been changing. I used to work out fasted. I used to always, because of the time of the day, like I'm usually in the gym quite early in the morning, and I had this aversion to eating. I have been trying lately some protein and oatmeal. So when I wake up, I'll just have some protein. I'll actually have oatmeal, and I'll put a scoop of protein powder in it, and with my coffee. And I've been finding if I can eat and then I'm in the gym about 45 minutes later, that's the time where that's about the amount of time that my body's processing the oatmeal and the protein powder. It's starting to spill out into the blood. I'm finding that my performance is actually much better. I was doing it on the weekends for a while, and then I was like, let me try it during the week as well. So I'm loving right now eating prior to my lifts. My cardio, I'll still do fasted, just because if I'm running, it's just like I feel like my stomach is like glug, 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 like it's jostling while I'm doing the workout. But the weight training, I like some protein and carbs before, and then after I eat as well. I'll have like my breakfast when I get home, but shot of coffee, primes the dopamine receptors for dopaminergic activity like lifting. So you're sort of waking up the brain, waking up the motor cortex. You're getting all these mood altering effects with the dopamine and stuff. And I've been eating a little bit. So I've been really, the the oatmeal and the protein is probably like 200, maybe 250 calories. So it's not like extreme, but it's enough substrate by the time I'm at the gym, I'm warmed up and I'm ready to lift, that I have a little bit more kind of, uh, precursors for energy that I can really get a better performance in the gym. So that's
I love
the thing I've been changing recently.
Yeah, I love that you have a degree of experimentation because I think that's so important. Sometimes we get so rigid about what works for us that we're unwilling to change things. I definitely can't do it before cardio, but I haven't actually experimented with eating before going to the gym because I feel like for me, we're in a new city and I don't love the gym we go to. And it's such an effort to put my butt in the car to drive to said
All
gym
right.
that I'm like,
Mhm.
anything that delays me getting in the car, I will make an excuse. And I'm just sharing this just to be completely forthright. I love the gym where we lived before. Now it's a little bit more effort, but I'm not a coffee drinker and I wish I was, but I will sometimes drink green tea.
Hmm.
My kids are always talking to me about pre-workouts because they hang out with the gym bros and the gym bros give
Mhm.
them all the things. And then I have to explain to them, well, actually, that aspartame and the sucralose and all that junk that's in a lot of the pre-workouts, you
Yeah.
probably might want to avoid. I know that Redmond's had sent me a pre-workout powder that had beta alanine in it, but it
Hmm.
made my skin itch.
Oh,
And so I was like,
interesting.
okay, that experiment of the N of one did not end well.
Mhm.
But I do know many people that will use Redmond's pre workout and do fine with it. So I
Hmm.
just add that that was my N of one experiment. Okay. I want to make sure that we're mindful of your time. What is your favorite supplement for middle aged women? I need some sleep support. I know that maintaining muscle is something you both discuss and speak about frequently.
Yeah, so there's a couple things. I would say for muscle, we've been talking a little bit about protein powder. So I'm a big fan of whey protein powder. So if you consider that a supplement, I would consider it a food, but we'll just, because you don't, it's a supplement. It comes in a tub usually. So whey protein is something that I use. Creatine, again, just with, in the lens of muscle, I would say 5 grams daily. I typically take it after my workout. You could take it before too. I don't think there's a big difference, but that's just the rhythm of my morning is I'll take it afterwards. So 5 grams. I would say in terms of other supplements that are important for women, midlife, let's say perimenopause, and I'll wrap in menopause in here as well. I would say omega-3s are super important for brain health and for reducing inflammation. So something like 1 to 3 grams of omega-3s daily. And if you have a supplement where you can rack up about a gram of DHA, so omega-3s are sort of two main, there's like the EPA, as you know, and the DHA. The DHA is specific to brain health. So I would say for women who are experiencing like brain fog, general malaise, even like joint aches and pains, 1 to 3 grams of omega-3s. I typically take like around 3 grams daily, and 1 gram of that is DHA. Um, Let me think what else. Vitamin D would be another big one. At least 4,000, like depending on where you live and how much sun exposure, natural sun exposure you have. Like I live on the East Coast, so we have all 4 seasons. We're, at the time of this recording, we're sort of, late fall, moving into winter. So my supplementation for vitamin D tends to go up in the wintertime when there's less available light. So it's like 4,000 IUs, I would say, at a minimum. And then for me in the wintertime, I tend to up it a little bit. So I'm like 5,000, 6,000 international units of vitamin D. And then the other one I would say is magnesium. Big one, right? The big favorite for women is like magnesium. I typically take it in the evening. I'll take a combination of glycinate, which is very, highly absorbable, very well tolerated by most people. And then I'll also take an L-threonate, which is the magnesium type that will cross the blood-brain barrier. Perimenopausal women, you probably find this, Cynthia, that one of the biggest complaints is sleep. All of a sudden we can't sleep well, or we can't maintain it, we can't initiate it. So magnesium, I like glycinate and L-threonate for that reason. And I would say if you're still cycling, like you're still a menstruating woman, you can cycle the magnesium. Like I typically will have about 400 mgs, like 400 milligrams sort of as a baseline. And then in that luteal phase, I typically amp it up again because we're more metabolically active in that time. We're developing that endometrial lining. I typically will up it 600, maybe some cases even like as high as a gram. Like I'll take some, if I'm particularly stressed, or particularly overworked, I know that I can go up to about a gram of magnesium without any of that, the digestive upset that like I sort of can, like a gram is about my upper tolerable limit for magnesium. So you can play with this again. Everybody's a little bit different. The way that you know that you're overdoing it is you're going to start to see loose stools, maybe some cramping, that kind of thing. Any other big hitters? That's my list. I would say that those are like I typically am a supplement minimalist. I don't like taking like gobs and gobs and gobs of supplements, but really good omega-3 for brain health as we age, as we're moving through perimenopause as well. I think that's super important. The vitamin D, it's a pro-hormone. It's not really a vitamin, it's like a pro-hormone. Magnesium, creatine, whey powder.
I think those are all great. I would say the thing about creatine that I've learned, it can be helpful for metabolic health, muscle health, but there's also this sleep architecture piece. You know, you need more of it to cross the blood-brain barrier, but I've been experimenting quite a bit with the sleep piece, and that has been helpful. I would say the only thing I might add is inositol, because I think I've been
Blood
very
sugar,
transparent
yeah.
with my listeners and said that completely changed the game with my sleep. And depending on how much stress I have, whether I'm jet lagged, I will increase or decrease. I could have 1 gram or 3 grams of inositol, and it's super easy, really well tolerated, and helps with insulin sensitivity. Okay, a couple other things that I want to make sure we touch on. Hormesis. So we've kind of touched on some of these things: cold exposure, cryotherapy, infrared sauna, HIIT, fasting. What are some of your kind of prevailing wisdom around hormetic stress and middle-aged women? I'm going to just pick on middle-aged women because we tend to be a little less stress tolerant at this stage in our lives. Because I think I recall Sarah Gottfried saying on the podcast that, you can have some genetic susceptibilities to, maybe you don't need to do ice baths. I swear I'm one of these people. I think we were having a conversation in your DMs. I was like, I'm so impressed with your plunge pool. I think I'm just going to do cryotherapy. But
Yeah.
how do we know where are the happy places? Like, how much exposure do we need to get the hormetic benefits?
I think it's hard to quantify person to person. Again, it's like this individual, you have to play a little bit. So for me, my background is, Mediterranean. So I have, parents from, my father's from Portugal. My mother's family is from the Middle East. So we are like warm-blooded. We love heat, right? So the cold is, and then of course I live on the East Coast, right? So you take that genetic archetype, which is used to the warmth, you put her in an environment where there's a very long drawn out winter, and it can be painful. I think for me with I'll wrap in the cold plunge here because it was very, I was reticent to do cold. I was like, I'll do sauna all day long. I'll do sauna every day. I can do the warm, but the cold was something that I was avoiding. And it's one of those things where you're like, okay, why am I avoiding this? Is there some benefit that is that the work, is that where the work actually lies? So I am somebody who, like you, and I think this is why we get along so well, is like I value excellence, right? I want to be self-actualized, and I want to be working towards expressing all of who I am. So I was like, all right, the cold plunge seems really difficult and it seems really awful. So I'm just going to try it to see how I like it. And when I first started doing it, I was only able to really tolerate like 16 degrees Celsius. That's probably like 57, maybe 58 degrees Fahrenheit. And I've worked to 13 degrees Celsius, like 54-ish, 55-ish Fahrenheit. I've been in colder pools, but it has been like my cold tolerance isn't there yet. Like if you look at if you look at Susanna Sodberg, who's she's plunging in, I think she's in Sweden, and she's in like 2 degrees Celsius water, which is like 30, maybe 40 Fahrenheit. It's insane. But her cold tolerance, like she's worked up to it, like she's built up a cold muscle, like she's built up her sort of her tolerance to the cold. So in the same way that, if I were to do, let's say, I don't know, bicep curls, and I pick up a pair of 25s, and someone says, "Oh my God, that's impossible. I could never do that. Like I can only pick up fives right now." It's like, okay. And with time and, with exercising that muscle, you'll be able to amplify, and you'll be able to jump from fives to sevens to tens. So I would say, often the work that you are repelled by or repulsed by is probably the work that you need to lean into. At least I found that for myself. And with cold plunge, I should also say it's like only like the science only, like, in order to get some of it's like 11 minutes a week. It's not like you should be staying in there for hours on end. It's like a really short stint and then you're out. The cold plunge for me is grit, and it's mental resilience, because I don't want to get into the cold plunge. I want to be warm and comfortable in my bed. But then I wake up and I go and do the cold plunge, and I do something uncomfortable first thing in the morning. So everything else in my day is easier. Even the weights that come after the cold plunge, everything else in my day is easier, because I've already overcome this sort of monkey in my mind that's like, don't do it. It's you're not supposed to be cold. You want to stay warm, So it's just a little stressor there. I think it's actually great for women with autoimmunity as well, because it's very cool. It's cold, right? So like quells the inflammation, or that pro-inflammatory state that we can see with women with autoimmunity. And it's just a little stimulus. It's just a little like 2 to 3 minute stint. Same thing with sauna. Same thing with weight. It's like the whole theme is stimulate, don't annihilate. Like, you don't want to stay for an hour in the cold plunge. You don't want to stay for an hour in the sauna. You don't want to overdo it at the gym. You want to be able to stimulate the body enough so that you are getting an adaptive response. So, I don't know. Does that answer your question, Cynthia? I don't know. Feel like
No, you did a great job. And I know this question will come up. You want to do cryo before lifting, not the opposite, because I think one of the
yeah,
things I read was there's a
yeah.
4-hour window after lifting that if you get into a cold plunge or cryotherapy, you can interrupt the muscle protein synthesis process. At least that was what I took
Yeah,
away
it's
from
the
the
pro, and
reading.
it's the inflammatory. So exercise is it's a eustress, but it's a stress, right? So you have this pro-inflammatory response that happens after you tear up the muscle, right? But if you cool that down, like, you actually want the muscle to be a little hot, right? So after the training. So if you are going to cold plunge and you're also training, the order would be cold plunge first and then train. Or if that's not possible for you, at least as you said, put that 4-hour buffer in. So you train, let's say in the morning or whatever time it is, and then you wait at least 4 hours before cold plunging. Typically cold in the morning, it wakes you up, right? So you're going to have this shock response, because and I'll tell you very honestly, when I first started, like, every single cell in my body was like, get the hell out of this tub, get out right now. Right. So it's like an alarm. It's like a shock response. So there's a lot of cortisol. There's a lot of the catecholamines, the epinephrine, the adrenaline, which then drives like dopamine and everything. So it's nice to do it in the morning, because that's actually when your cortisol is supposed to be high. If you do it too late in the evening, it can sort of be I find a little bit too stimulating. So I don't like to do cold in the evening. So if you work out in the morning, maybe like a noon or like mid-afternoon plunge might be fine. And then heat, of course, is really nice in the evening for those of us that are trying to augment our sleep, because what will happen is this rebound, right? Where you are going to overheat the body essentially in the sauna, and then your body is going to work really hard to reduce your core body temperature once you get out of there, right? So that's also going to help you fall asleep and stay asleep. So the general rule of thumb is cold in the morning. That can be in your shower. You don't need to have a cold plunge. Although if you do have a cold plunge, I highly recommend getting one with a chiller, so you don't have to constantly throw ice. And I was like going to the gas station, like, a couple times a week, getting like these huge things of ice. And I was like, okay, this is ridiculous. I'm just going to get a cold plunge with a chiller. So I would say cold in the morning, heat in the evening. And then you get it in it's the same with the sauna as well. Like there's some people who can, and we all know this, like you get in, my mother could take a bath that she could sit in a bath. And if I put my hand in it, like it would be scalding. Right. So we all have sort of these like different, nociceptive and like inputs in terms of like our tolerance to heat. And tolerance to cold, which can be worked, right? Which can be improved the more we do them.
Yeah. And I couldn't agree with you more that more often than not, the things we try to avoid doing are the things that we need to do. Well, as always, an amazing conversation. There are a lot of questions that we didn't get to, but please be reassured if you asked a question we didn't get to, we'll save it for the next conversation. Please let my listeners know how to connect with you, how to listen to your amazing podcast, etc.
Oh, thank you so much. So Cynthia and I are fellow podcasters, and we're going to release this together. So this will be on my show and on hers at the same time. My podcast is called Better with Dr. Stephanie. So very similar to Cynthia insofar as I like to speak to world leaders, scientists and doctors and people who are changing the game and changing the way that we think about what it means to have a well-lived life. So Better with Dr. Stephanie, we have weekly episodes there. I'm pretty active on Instagram. I try to be active on Instagram. So you'll see me posting a lot of workout things. And, whenever there's a really interesting clip from the podcast, I'll be there. I'll post that there as well. And I'll post like educational content. So it's at Dr. Stephanie Estima. So Dr. first name, last name. And then if you want to watch the show, we're on YouTube as well. So you can just look up Dr. Stephanie Estima, and there's my channel there as well. And then the last one is the book. So starting to get ready I'm thinking about writing another book, but my current book, my baby, is called The Betty Body. So it's about cyclical living, how to alter food and training and sleep and all these things in accordance with a woman's menstrual cycle. So that's called The Betty Body. And you can find that, any good bookstore, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, all the places.
A great book. Thank you again.
Hey, if you like this video, you guys are going to love this video, and I'll see you there.
The conversation I'd love to have with every 35-year-old woman is that once 40 hits, your ovaries are going to be done. And they're going to slowly, it's not like it's done overnight. They're going to slowly decline. It's going to take 10 to 15 years for these ovaries to be out. But you literally have an organ that is done doing its job. Mm-hmm. It'd be like if your heart was like, hey, I'm done. I'm just going to slowly like this. I don't understand why we don't talk about this.
Right.